This book contains up to 4 sides per cassette. Side 1, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Copyright 1988 by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. All rights reserved. Narrated by Gary Tipton. This book contains 293 pages on 11 sides. If you would like to skip over any remaining announcements or introductory material, place your cassette player and fast forward until a beep is heard. Stop at that point to hear the beginning of the book. Annotation. An adventure of suspense, intrigue, and passion. Photojournalist Carol Dawson's investigation into the loss of a Navy missile leads to entanglement in conspiracies, pursuit by killers, and the knowledge that one wrong move could cause annihilation of the human race. Strong language and some descriptions of sex. 1988. From the book jacket. Arthur C. Clarke's brilliant imagination now spawns a spine-tingling modern adventure of suspense, intrigue, and passionate drama. One that ranges from the unguessable past to the edge of tomorrow, from the vast ocean of stars to the bottom of the sea. And one that forces military spies, warring high-tech treasure hunters, and a beautiful, ambitious reporter to confront a horrifying challenge pivotal to world destiny or human extinction. Miami photojournalist Carol Dawson arrives in Key West to cover a whale beaching. The vast, gentle animals have been tragically casting themselves ashore, their navigational instincts gone haywire. But Carol's real story is to investigate rumors that the U.S. Navy misfired and lost the prototype for its new Panther missile. Using a state-of-the-art ocean telescope, Carol hopes to grab the Panther and expose a Navy cover-up. She covertly charters the diving boat Florida Queen, captained by Nick Williams, a woman-hating Ivy League dropout still scarred by a traumatic youthful affair. But Nick has his own agenda. Cheated out of his share of a sunken treasure, Nick wants to get even with his ex-partners, a kinky pair whose SM games turn lethal when their secret gold hoard is threatened. And the Navy's investigator, glory-hungry Lieutenant Richard Todd, is convinced that Carol, Nick, and Nick's amiable crewman, Troy Jefferson, are Soviet agents who must be stopped at any cost. Then Carol discovers underwater tracks, a disappearing reef, and a hole in the seabed where the Panther should be. Suddenly, Carol, Nick, and Troy are dragged into the heart of a terrifying, unearthly secret. And from that moment, nowhere is safe. Trapped in a clash of conspiracies, pursued by killers, military police, and a relentless alien force, the three adventurers must solve a mystery beyond comprehension. And one wrong hunch, one wrong deduction, one wrong move will trigger the start of human annihilation, even if the thing beneath the sea is not evil. Because even in space, the road to hell may be paved with good intentions. The creator of 2001 has brought his thrilling, eerie vision to unknown seas. About the authors. For more than 40 years, Arthur C. Clarke's spellbinding stories have captivated readers worldwide. Grand Master and winner of numerous Hugo and Nebula Awards, Clarke is the author of such critically acclaimed best-selling classics as 2061, 2001, A Space Odyssey, Rendezvous with Rama, The Songs of Distant Earth, Childhood's End, and the underwater thriller The Deep Range. More than 10 million copies of Clarke's books are now in print. Arthur C. Clarke lives in Sri Lanka. Gentry Lee is chief engineer of the Galileo project at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, past director of science analysis and mission planning for the Viking mission, and Carl Sagan's partner in the creation, development, and implementation of the Cosmos television series. Mr. Lee lives in California. Dedication. This book is dedicated to the 4 youngest children in our families, Shireen, Tamara, Robert, and Patrick. May their lives be filled with joy and wonder. Credits. Executive producer, Peter Goober. Production executives, Roger Birnbaum, Lucy Fisher. Production designer, Arthur C. Clarke. Location manager, Gentry Lee. Logistics and catering, Hector Akanayaki, Valerie Akanayaki. Research assistants, Jerry Snyder, Alan Ladwig. Story consultants, Cooper Lee, Austin Lee. Casting director, Stacy Kiddu Lee. Assistant director, Russell Galen. Producer, Gentry Lee. Director, Arthur C. Clarke. Endangered species. The emerald water smashes against the dark volcanic cliffs. Fine white spray hovers over the harsh rock, creating a misty veil that glimmers in the fading light. In the distance, 2 yellow suns set simultaneously, separated by about 40 degrees as they disappear together below the horizon. Across the blue-black sky on the opposite side of the isthmus that slopes gently downward from the volcanic cliffs to another ocean, a pair of full moons rise as the 2 suns vanish. Their twin moonlight, although much weaker than the shine of the disappearing suns, is still strong enough to create dancing moon shadows on the ocean beneath the rocky overhang. As the dual moons rise on the eastern side of the isthmus, light begins to glow on the horizon beside them, about 20 degrees to the south. At first, the glow looks like the light of a distant city, but with each passing moment it brightens until it spreads across the sky. At length, an awesome third moon, its first chord coming over the horizon when the twin moons are maybe 10 degrees into their arc, begins to rise. Calm descends on both oceans for a few seconds, as if the world beneath the giant orb has paused to give homage to the spectacular sight. This great yellow moon, its face clearly scarred by craters, appears to be surveying its dominion as it slowly rises in the sky and bathes the emerald oceans in a mysterious reflected light. It is 100 times the size of the smaller twin moons, and its wide swath through the sky is greater in size than that cut minutes before by the pair of setting suns. Below the cliffs, in the shadow of the newest moon, a long, sinuous object arcs its way out of the water, rising nearly 20 feet above the surface. The slender apparition twists itself toward the cliffs and thrusts itself forward as the piercing sound of a trumpet, a solo blast, reverberates against the rocks and carries across the isthmus. A moment later, another sound is heard, a muted echo or possibly a reply from the other sea. The creature swims gracefully into the moonlight, its long, live neck a cobalt blue above a gray body mostly submerged in the ocean. Now the blue-necked serpent extends itself upward again and leans toward the land, its face revealed in the expanding moonlight. The facial features are convoluted and complex, with rows of orifices of unknown purpose. At the peak of its extension, the creature contorts its face, and a medley of sounds is heard. The trumpet blast is now accompanied by an oboe and an organ. After a short pause, a muted response, quieter, but with the same rich complexity of sound, comes back across the isthmus. The missile should then have found the aircraft carrier and, using the reaction control jets as its primary control authority, made whatever vernier corrections were necessary to impact the old carrier on the main deck. Todd pushed a key on the podium, and a line-drawing map of the American East Coast, including the area from Labrador through Cuba, appeared on the left screen. The missile was a final test version, he continued, in the exact configuration of the production flight vehicle, except for the command test set and the warhead. This was to be the longest test flight yet conducted, and was designed to demonstrate thoroughly the new 4.2 version of the software that was recently installed in the APRS. So, of course, the missile was not armed. The lieutenant picked up a light pen from the podium and marked on the small monitor in front of him. His markings were immediately translated to the larger screen behind him so that everyone could easily follow his discussion. On the screen, you all can see the predicted versus actual overflight path of the bird yesterday. Here, roughly 10 miles east of Cape Canaveral, on what appeared to be a nominal flight, the sequencer turned on the cameras. After a couple of hundred calibration images, sort of a self-test of the APRS, the terminal guidance algorithms were activated as scheduled. As far as we can tell from the real-time telemetry, nothing strange had occurred until this time. The right screen now showed a detailed map of South Florida and the Keys that included the target in the Bahamas. The maps on the two flanking screens remained in view during the rest of his presentation, but Lieutenant Todd constantly changed the word charts in the middle to keep up with the discussion. The a priori location of the target, which was where the cameras should first have looked for the aircraft carrier, was here at Eleuthera, in the Bahamas. The search algorithm should have fanned out in a circle from there and, if it had operated properly, found the target in about 15 seconds. This, Todd pointed toward a dotted line on the more detailed map, should have been the impact trajectory. However, Todd continued dramatically, based on the telemetry data that we have analyzed to date, it appears that the missile veered sharply westward toward the coast of Florida soon after the terminal guidance system was activated. We have only been able to reconstruct its path up to this point, where it was about 3 miles west of Miami Beach at an altitude of 10,000 feet. After that, the telemetry becomes intermittent and erratic. But we do know that all the terminal guidance engines were on at the time we lost complete data. Projecting the total control authority for the missile, the area highlighted here, covering the Everglades, the Keys, and even as far south as Cuba, represents where the bird might have landed. Lieutenant Todd paused for a second, and Commander Winters, who had been writing down major points in a small notebook during the presentation, immediately jumped in and started taking charge of the meeting. "A couple of questions, Lieutenant, before we proceed." Winters began in a businesslike manner with an obvious overtone of authority. "First, why was the missile not destroyed soon after it veered off course?" "We're not exactly certain, Commander. The command test set and the small ordnance had been installed, of course, specifically for that purpose. The change in the motion of the vehicle was so sudden and so unexpected that we reacted a little slowly at the beginning. By the time we sent the command, it's possible that we were out of range. All we know is that we never saw an explosion of any kind. We can only assume—" "We'll come back to this operational error later," Winters interrupted him again. Todd blanched at the word error and fidgeted behind the podium. "Where would the impact point have been according to the guidance constants active at the time of the last complete telemetry packet? And how long is it going to take us to extract additional information from the intermittent data?" Lieutenant Todd noted to himself that the commander was sharp. Winters had obviously been associated with anomaly investigations before. Todd then explained that if the active guidance constants had not changed again, the continued firing of the terminal engines would have brought the missile to an impact point about 20 miles south of Key West. However, Todd added, the constants were allowed by the software to change every 5 seconds, and they had changed in 2 of the last 5 internal data updates. So it's unlikely they stayed the same as they were when our complete telemetry terminated. Unfortunately, although all the constants, even the future predicted ones that are being calculated by the APRS, are stored in the onboard computer, because of bandwidth limitations, we only transmit the active constants with the real-time telemetry. We are now going through the dropout data manually to see if we can find out anything more about the constants. One of the other staff officers asked a question about the probability of the missile actually having reached Cuba. Lieutenant Todd answered, "Very low," and then activated an electronic overlay that placed a dotted and blinking trajectory on the right screen inset map. The blinking dots followed a path that started just off Coral Gables, south of the city of Miami, and then continued across a portion of South Florida into the Gulf of Mexico, across the Keys, and finally into the ocean again. It is along this line that we intend to concentrate our search. Unless the bird suddenly changed its mind, its general heading would have been consistent with a perceived target located anywhere along this path. And since we have no reports of any land impact near a populated area, we assumed that the missile landed in the Everglades or the ocean. Lieutenant Todd had consulted briefly with Winters the previous evening on the agenda for the meeting. It had been scheduled to last only an hour, but the number of questions caused it to stretch to an hour and a half. Todd was thorough and precise in his presentation, but was obviously dismayed by Winters' continued probing into the possibility of human error. The lieutenant freely admitted that they had blown the procedure to destroy the missile when it went awry, but defended his men by citing the unusual circumstances and the nearly perfect previous record enjoyed by the Panther missile. He also explained that they were going to equip their search vessels with the best possible instrumentation, including the new ocean telescope developed by the Miami Oceanographic Institute, and began searching the outlying areas in earnest the next day. Winters asked many questions about the possible cause of the missile's strange behavior. Todd told him that he and his staff were convinced that it was a software problem, that some new or updated algorithm in the 4.2 version of the software had somehow scrambled both the initialization sequence and the optically stored target parameters. Winters accepted their opinion eventually, but not until he ordered them to prepare a top-down failure modes analysis that would list every possible hardware, software, or operational error — Todd winced when Winters mentioned operations again — that could lead to the kind of problem observed. Toward the end of the meeting, Winters reiterated the secrecy of the activity and pointed out that the Broken Arrow project was to remain completely unknown to the press. "Commander," Todd broke in while Winters was explaining the press policy. The lieutenant had begun the meeting with confidence, but was feeling increasingly unsettled. "Sir, I had a call late yesterday afternoon from a reporter, a Carolyn or Kathy Dawson, I think, from the Miami Herald. She told me that she had heard of some special activity down here and that I was supposedly connected with it. She claimed her source was someone in the Pentagon." Winters shook his head. "Shit, Lieutenant. Why didn't you say something before this? Can't you imagine what will happen if the word gets out that one of our missiles wandered over Miami?" He paused. "What did you tell her?" "I didn't tell her anything, but I think she is still suspicious. She called the Public Affairs Office after she talked to me." Winters gave an order that the existence of the Broken Arrow investigation was to be kept classified and that any and all inquiries arbitrarily to follow the sound. The telephone was ringing on a boat just in front of her. A husky man in his early 30s was sitting in a folding chair on the same boat. Wearing only a red baseball cap, a pair of swim trunks, dark sunglasses, and some thongs, the man was intently watching a small television propped up on a flimsy tray of some kind. He held a sandwich in one hand. Carol could see the white mayonnaise oozing out between the slices of bread, even from her distance of 10 yards or so, and a can of beer in the other. There was no sign that the man in the red cap even heard the telephone. Carol moved closer, a little curious. A basketball game was in progress on the television. On about the 6th ring of the phone, the man gave a small cheer, with his mouth full of sandwich, in the direction of the 6-inch picture tube, took a swig from his beer, and abruptly jumped up to answer the call. The telephone was underneath a canopy in the center of the boat, on a wooden paneled wall, behind the steering wheel and next to some built-in counters that appeared to contain the navigation and radio equipment for the boat. The man fiddled with the steering wheel unconsciously during the brief conversation and never took his eyes off the television. He hung up, issued another short cheer, and returned to his folding chair. Carol was now standing on the jetty just inches away from the front of the boat and no more than 10 feet away from where the man was sitting. But he was oblivious to her, totally absorbed in his basketball game. "All right," he shouted all at once, reacting to something pleasing in the game. He jumped up. The sudden movement caused the boat to rock, and the jerry-built tray underneath the television gave way. The man reached out quickly and grabbed the TV before it hit the ground, but in doing so, he lost his balance and fell forward on his elbows. "Shit," he said to himself, wincing from the pain. He was lying on the deck, his sunglasses cocked sideways on his head, the game still continuing on the little set in his hands. Carol could not suppress her laughter. Now aware that he was not alone for the first time, Nick Williams, the owner and operator of the Florida Queen, turned in the direction of the feminine laugh. "Excuse me," Carol began in a friendly way. "I just happened to be walking by, and I saw you fall." She stopped. Nick was not amused. "What do you want?" Nick fixed her with a truculent glare. He stood up, still holding and watching the television, and now trying as well to put the tray back together. He didn't have enough hands to do everything at once. "You know," Carol said, still smiling, "I could help you with that if it wouldn't injure your masculine pride." Uh-oh, Nick thought in a flash. Another pushy, assertive broad. Nick put the television down on the deck of the boat and began to reassemble the tray. "No, thank you," he said. "I can manage." Obviously ignoring Carol, he set the TV back on the tray, returned to his folding chair, and picked up his sandwich and beer. Carol was amused by what Nick had clearly intended as a put-down. She looked around the boat. Neatness was not one of the strengths of the proprietor. Little odds and ends, including masks, snorkels, regulators, towels, and even old lunches from fast food restaurants, were scattered all over the front of the boat. In one of the corners, someone had obviously taken apart a piece of electronic equipment, perhaps for repair, and left the entire works a jumbled mess. Mounted on the top of the blue canopy were two signs, each with a different type of print, one giving the name of the boat, and the other saying, "Thank you for not smoking." The boat looked out of character for the sleek modern marina, and Carol imagined the other boat owners reacting with disgust each day as they passed the Florida Queen. On an impulse, Carol looked at the computer listing in her hand. She almost laughed out loud when she saw the boat listing as one of the 9 available for hire. "Excuse me," she began, intending to start the discussion about chartering the boat for the afternoon. Nick heaved an exaggerated sigh and turned away from his televised basketball game. The miffed look on his face was unmistakable. It said, "What? Are you still here? I thought we'd finished our conversation. Now go away and let me enjoy the afternoon on my boat." Mischievous Carol couldn't resist the opportunity to harass the arrogant Mr. Williams. She assumed that the name on the computer listing and the man in front of her were the same, for she couldn't imagine a crew member acting with such apparent confidence and authority on someone else's boat. "Who's playing?" she said cheerfully, as if she had no idea that Nick was trying to get rid of her. "Harvard and Tennessee," he answered gruffly, amazed that Carol hadn't got the message. "What's the score?" she said quickly, now enjoying the game she had just created. Nick turned around again, his quizzical look acknowledging his exasperation. "It's 31-29, Harvard," he said sharply, "just before the end of the first half." Carol didn't move. She simply smiled and returned his fierce stare without blinking. "And it's the first round of the NCAA tournament, and they're playing in the Southeast Regional. Any more questions?" "Just one," she said. "I would like to charter this boat for the afternoon. Are you Nick Williams?" He was taken by surprise. "What?" Nick said. At that minute, Tennessee tied the basketball game again, distracting Nick even further. He watched the game for a couple of seconds and then tried to collect himself. "But I have had no calls from Julianne. Anyone who wants to charter a boat here at Hemingway has to sign in at the desk, and—" "I came down to look at another boat first. I didn't like it, so I stopped by here on the way back." Nick was watching the television again, and Carol was losing her patience with him. At first, he had been amusing. "At least I don't have to worry about his pawing me," she thought. "The guy can't even concentrate on me enough to get his boat chartered." "Look," she added, "do you want a charter for this afternoon or not?" The first half of the basketball game ended. "All right, I guess so," Nick said slowly, thinking to himself, "only because I need the money." He gestured to Carol to descend onto the deck of the boat. "Let me just call Julianne and make sure you're legit. You never know these days." While Nick confirmed Carol's identification with the marina headquarters, a jaunty young black man in his early 20s came down the jetty and stopped just opposite the Florida Queen. "Hey, Professor," he said, the moment Nick was off the phone. "Am I in the wrong place?" He motioned to Carol. "You didn't tell me you were entertaining beauty, style, and class today. Ooh-wee, look at that jewelry and that silk blouse. Should I go now and come back to hear your stories later?" He winked at Carol. "He's no good, Angel. All his girlfriends eventually end up with me." Side 2, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 31. "Cut the crap, Jefferson," Nick reacted. "This woman is a potential customer, and you're late as usual. How do you expect me to run a charter dive boat when I don't have any idea when or if my crew is going to show up?" "Professor," the newcomer jumped down on the boat and walked up to Carol. "If I had known that you had something that looked like this down here, I would have been here before dawn." "Hello there, young lady. My name is Troy Jefferson. I am the rest of the crew on this lunatic asylum off a boat." Carol had been slightly discombobulated by the arrival of Troy and the quick repartee that followed, but she adapted swiftly and regained her composure. She took Troy's outstretched hand and smiled. He immediately leaned up and almost brushed his cheek against hers. "Ooh-wee!" Troy pulled back, grinning. "I've just caught a whiff of Oscar de la Renta. Professor, didn't I tell you this woman had class?" "Well, Angel," he looked at Carol in mock admiration, "I just can't tell you how much it means to me to finally meet up with someone like you on this tub. Usually we get old ladies, who want to—" "Enough, Jefferson," Nick interrupted him. "We have work to do. It's almost noon already, and we're still at least half an hour away from being ready to leave." All these strange events were related. Nick was off to her right, about 20 yards away. He was pointing at something on the other side of the whales and gesturing for Carol to come toward him. She swam away from the great mammals and headed in Nick's direction. She saw immediately what had attracted his attention. Below the whales, just above the ocean floor, there was a large dark hole in the bottom of an imposing reef structure. At first glance, it appeared to be the entrance to an underground cave of some kind. But Carol's sharp eyes noticed that the lip-shaped fissure was extremely smooth and symmetric, almost suggesting to her that it was an engineering construction of some kind. She laughed at herself as she swam up beside Nick. The amazing underwater world and the bizarre behavior of these whales were playing tricks with her mind. Nick pointed down at the hole and then at himself, indicating that he was going down to check it out more closely. When he started to leave, Carol had a sudden impulse to reach for his foot and pull him back. A moment later, as she watched Nick swim away, a powerful fear of unknown origin swept over her. She began to tremble as she struggled gamely with this strange emotion. Goosebumps appeared on her arms and legs, and Carol felt an overwhelming desire to get away, to escape, before something terrible happened. An instant later, she saw one of the whales move toward Nick. If Carol had been on land, she could have yelled, but 50 feet deep in the ocean, there was no way to warn someone from afar. As Nick drew near the opening, unaware of any danger, he was brushed to the side by one of the whales with such force that he bounced against the reef and then caromed off. He fell down onto a small spot of sand on the ocean floor. Carol swam toward him quickly, while keeping a careful eye on the whales. Nick had lost his regulator and did not seem to be making any attempt to replace it. She drew up beside him and flashed the thumbs-up sign. There was no response. Nick's eyes were closed. Carol felt a surge of adrenaline as she reached for Nick's regulator and thrust it into his mouth. She beat against his mask with her fist. After a few painfully long seconds, Nick opened his eyes. Carol tried thumbs up again. Nick shook his head, as if he were clearing out the cobwebs, smiled, and then returned the OK signal. He started to move, but Carol restrained him. She indicated with gestures for him to sit still, while she hurriedly looked him over. From the force with which Nick had hit the reef, Carol feared the worst. Even if his diving gear was all right, certainly his skin would have been ripped and torn by the sharp coral and the impact. But incredibly, there did not appear to be significant damage to either Nick or the equipment. All she could find were a couple of small scrapes. The 3 whales remained in the same area where they had been before. Looking up at them from below, Carol thought that they looked like sentinels guarding a particular piece of ocean territory. Back and forth they swam, inscribing a total composite arc of maybe 200 yards. Whatever it had been that had caused one of the whales to vary its swimming pattern and run into Nick was certainly unclear, but Carol did not want to risk another encounter. She motioned for Nick to follow her, and they swam about 30 yards away to a sandy trench between the reefs. Carol planned to return to the surface as soon as it was clear that Nick was not seriously hurt. But while Carol was thoroughly surveying his body to make certain that she had not overlooked any serious lacerations in her hurried check, Nick discovered 2 parallel indentations in the sand below him. He grabbed Carol's arm to show her what he had found. The indentations were grooved like tank tracks and were about 3 inches deep. They appeared to be fresh. In one direction, the tracks ran toward the reef fissure underneath the 3 whales. In the other direction, the parallel lines extended as far as Nick and Carol could see, running along the sandy trench between the 2 major reefs in the area. Nick pointed up the trench and then swam away in that direction, following the tracks with fascination. He did not turn around to see if Carol were following. Carol quickly backtracked as close to the fissure as she dared. Was she imagining again, or were the 3 whales watching her as she crept along the ocean floor? To take some pictures and to verify that the tracks did indeed emanate from the opening in the reef. She thought she saw a network of similar indentations converging just in front of the fissure. But she did not tarry long. She didn't want to be separated from Nick in this spooky place. When she turned around, he was just barely in sight. But he had fortunately stopped when he realized that Carol was not behind him. Nick made an apologetic gesture when she finally caught up with him. At one point, the parallel lines disappeared as the sandy trench turned to rock. But Nick and Carol located the continuation of the same tracks some 50 yards farther along. The trench eventually became so narrow that they were forced to swim 6 feet or so above it to keep from banging against the rocks and coral on either side. Soon thereafter, the tracks and the trench made a left turn and disappeared under an overhang. Carol and Nick stopped and floated in the water facing each other. They carried on a conversation with hand gestures. At length, they decided that Carol would go down first to see if anything was under the overhang, since she wanted a close-up photograph of the disappearance of the tracks anyway. Side 3, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 58. Carol swam carefully down to the floor of the trench, skillfully avoiding contact with the edges of the reef on both sides. Where it disappeared under the overhang, the trench was just wide enough for her to put one of her flippered feet down lengthwise. The overhang was about 18 inches above the floor. But there was no way she could bend down and look underneath without scraping her face or hands against the reef. Carol gingerly slid her hand under the overhang in the last direction of the tracks. Nothing. She would have to brace herself against the rocks and coral and stick her hand deeper into the area. While Carol was trying to move herself into a better position, she momentarily lost her balance and felt the sting of coral on the back of her left thigh. Ouch, she thought as she put her right hand back under the overhang. That's one for me. One physical reminder of an amazing day. Weird even. Bizarre whales. Tank tracks on the bottom of the ocean. What is this? Carol's hand closed around what felt like a metallic rod about an inch thick. It was such a surprising touch, she immediately withdrew her hand, and a shudder raced down her spine. Her heart rate accelerated, and she tried to breathe slowly to calm herself. Then she purposefully put her hand back and found the object again. Or was it another object? This time she felt something metallic, all right, but it seemed to be wider and to have 4 tines like a fork. Carol slid her hand along the object and refound the rod portion. From his vantage point above her, Nick could tell that Carol had discovered something. Now it was his turn to be excited. He swam down to her as she struggled unsuccessfully to retrieve the object. They changed positions, and Nick reached under the projecting rock. He first touched something that felt like a smooth sphere about the size of the palm of his hand. Nick could tell that the bottom of the sphere rested on the sand, and that the rod attached to it was elevated by several inches. Nick steadied himself and jerked on the rod. It moved a little. He moved his grip sideways on the rod and heaved again. Several more pulls, and the object was out from under the overhang. For almost a minute, Nick and Carol hovered over the gold metallic object lying beneath them on the sand. Its surface was smooth to the eye as well as to the touch, and altogether it was about 18 inches long. Nothing but the polished, reflecting surface could be seen, suggesting that the object was indeed made from some kind of metal. The long axis of the object was an inch-thick rod that was, at one end, tapered and worked into a kind of a hook. 4 inches back from the hook was the center of a small sphere, symmetrically constructed around the rod, whose radius was a little over 2 inches. The larger sphere that Nick had felt when he first put his hand under the overhang had a radius of 4 inches or so, and it was right in the middle of the rod. This sphere was also perfectly symmetric around the rod out to look at it, as he had done 4 or 5 times the night before. What was this thing? He asked himself. It must have had some practical use, for it's too damn ugly to be ornamental. He shook his head. Amanda will know. If anyone can tell me where this thing came from, she can. Nick walked across his bedroom to the sliding glass doors and opened the curtains. It was almost sunrise. Beyond the small balcony outside, he could see the beach and the ocean. His condominium was on the 3rd floor and had an unspoiled view of the quiet surf. Above the water, a couple of brown pelicans soared in graceful formation, waiting for a chance to descend into the water and catch some unsuspecting fish swimming too close to the surface. Nick watched a couple in their 70s walking slowly along the beach. They were holding hands and talking quietly. A couple of times the woman broke away to pick up a shell or two and put it in a small Ziploc bag. Nick turned away from the door and grabbed the jeans that he had dropped on the floor the night before. He pulled them on over his undershorts and walked into the living room, carrying the bag with the trident. He put the golden object carefully on the table where he could study it, and then went back into the open kitchen to start the coffee maker and turn on the radio. Except for the books, Nick's living room was decorated just like hundreds of Florida seaside condominiums. The couch and easy chair were comfortable and bright, cream in color, with a couple of light green ferns in the pattern for decoration. 2 small paintings of water birds standing on an empty beach adorned the otherwise empty walls. Light beige drapes that matched the carpet framed the long sliding glass doors that led to the balcony with the rattan patio furniture. It was the books that gave the apartment some individuality. Along the wall opposite the couch, between the living room and the bedroom, was the large wood bookcase. It stretched almost all the way from the sliding glass doors in front of the balcony to the bedroom door. Although the general appearance of the apartment was one of disarray, newspapers and sports magazines strewn about here and there on the coffee table, clothes and towels on the floor in the bedroom and the bathroom, dirty dishes in the sink, the dishwasher standing open half full of dishes, the bookcase area was clearly well maintained. Altogether, there must have been 400 or 500 books on the 4 shelves of the long bookcase, all paperbacks, virtually all novels, and all carefully filed according to category. In front of each group of books, scotch-taped to the outside of the bookshelf, was a sheet of paper identifying the category. Nick had finished a fan's notes on the boat on Thursday, and had already put it back in its proper place on the shelf, in the category of American 20th Century A to G, right next to a dozen or more books by William Faulkner. He had then selected for his bedtime reading a 19th century French novel, Madame Bovary, by Gustave Flaubert. Nick had read the book once before, during his sophomore year at Harvard, and had not thought that much about it. However, he had been recently surprised to find the book on several lists of the 10 finest novels of all time, ranking right up there with such masterpieces as Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Perhaps I missed something the first time, he had told himself the previous night, before deciding to read it again. Side 4, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 90. But Nick had not been able to focus on the magnificently detailed descriptions of life in provincial France 150 years earlier. As he had followed the story of the lovely Emma Bovary, a woman for whom the stultifying sameness of her life was cause enough to have affairs that would eventually scandalize her village, the excitement of Nick's own life, for once, kept intruding. He was unable to suspend himself in the novel. His mind kept returning to the possibilities offered by the golden object in the exercise bag. Nick turned the object over and over in his hands while he drank his morning coffee. Then he had an idea. He walked back to the second bedroom, just opposite the kitchen and next to the laundry room, and opened the closet door. Nick used most of this closet as a storage area. In the corner of the closet were 4 huge cardboard boxes of junk that he had brought with him when he had bought the condominium 7 years earlier. He had never opened them even once in the intervening time. But he did remember that in one of those boxes were a bunch of photographs of the objects they had brought up from the Santa Rosa. Maybe if I look at those pictures, he thought to himself as he struggled to find the right container in the dimly lit closet, I will see something that looks like that thing. He finally located the correct box and dragged it out into the middle of the living room. At one time, its contents might have been well organized, for there were manila folders with filing labels inside. But almost all of the papers and photos and newspaper clippings had fallen out of their original places and were now scattered around the box in a loose jumble. Nick reached in and pulled out a clipping from the Miami Herald. It was yellow from age and had been crammed down into one of the corners. 5 people, including Nick, were featured in a big photograph on the front page. Nick stopped for a moment and looked at the photo and the caption. Has it really been that long? He wondered. Almost 8 years since we found the Santa Rosa. The caption identified the 5 individuals in the photograph as the crew of the Neptune, a dive and salvage boat that had found an old Spanish ship named the Santa Rosa sunk in the Gulf of Mexico about 15 miles north of the Dry Tortugas. Gold and silver objects worth more than $2 million had been retrieved from the vessel and were piled in front of a happy, smiling crew. From left to right, they were Greta Earhart, Jake Lewis, Homer Ashford, Ellen Ashford, and Nick Williams. That was before they started eating, Nick thought to himself. Ellen ate because of Greta, because it gave her an excuse in her own mind for what was happening with Homer. And Homer ate because he could afford it, just like he does everything else. For some people, constraints are the only thing that saves them. Give them freedom and they go berserk. Nick dug deeper into the box, looking for a set of 20 or so photographs that showed most of the large gold items they had retrieved from the Santa Rosa. Eventually, he started finding some of the pictures in groups of 4 or 5 in different parts of what was now becoming a hopeless pile at the bottom of the box. Each time he would find some more photos, he would pull them out, look at them carefully, and then shake his head to acknowledge that the golden trident did not look a thing like any of the objects from the Santa Rosa. At the bottom of the box, Nick encountered a yellow manila folder with a rubber band carefully wrapped around it. Thinking at first that this folder might contain the rest of the pictures from the Santa Rosa, Nick pulled out the folder and opened it hastily. An 8x11 picture of a beautiful woman in her early 30s slid out and fell on the living room floor. It was followed by handwritten notes, cards, a few letters and envelopes, and then about 20 sheets of bond paper covered with double-spaced typing. Nick sighed. How was it possible that he hadn't recognized this folder? The woman in the portrait had long black hair, lightly frosted in the front. She was wearing a dark red cotton blouse, slightly open at the top to show a triple strand of pearls just under the neck. In blue ink that contrasted with the red of the blouse, someone with magnificent, clearly artistic handwriting had written, Mon cher, je t'aime, Monique, across the lower right portion of the photograph. Nick bent down on his knees to pick up the scattered contents of the folder. He looked at the portrait carefully, his heart skipping a few beats as he remembered how beautiful she had been. Architectures. Don't you ever wonder about their feelings, their dreams while they are sleeping, their concepts of death? Well, I do, Oscar replied with a twinkle in his eye. But it's virtually impossible for human beings, even with a common language and developed communication skills, to truly describe their feelings. How could we even know or appreciate, for example, a dolphin's sense of loneliness? In our maudlin way, we ascribe to them human emotions, which is ridiculous. He paused for a moment to think. No, he continued, it's more fruitful to conduct scientific inquiry at levels where we can understand the answers. In the long run, I believe that knowing how these creatures function, in the scientific sense, is more likely to lead us to their emotional quotients than conducting psychological experiments whose outcomes cannot be interpreted. Carol reached over and kissed him fondly. You take everything I say so seriously, Oscar. Even when I'm kidding, you always pay attention to my comments. She stopped and looked away. You're the only one who does. Oscar pulled back dramatically and put both his hands on Carol's right shoulder. Somewhere here there's a chip. I know it for a fact. It's almost always here. Ah, I found it. He looked at her knowingly. It's not becoming, you know. Here you are, a successful, even celebrated reporter, still suffering from what could only be described as terminal insecurity. What's this about? Did you and the boss have a big fight this morning? No, Carol replied, as they walked across the room to another part of the aquarium. Well, sort of, I guess. You know how he is. He takes over everything. I'm working on this big story down in Key West. Dale comes to the airport to pick me up, takes me out to breakfast, and proceeds to tell me exactly what I should be doing to cover my assignment. His suggestions are almost all good, and I appreciate his help on the technical issues. But it's the way he talks to me, as if he thinks I'm stupid or something. Oscar looked at her intently. Carol, my dear, he talks to everybody that way, including me. He doesn't mean anything by it. He is absolutely convinced of his own superiority, and nothing has ever happened in his life to change his mind. He was a millionaire from his own patents before he graduated from MIT. Carol was impatient and frustrated. I know all that, Oscar. Believe me, I know. But you're protecting him again. Dale and I have been lovers for almost a year. He tells everybody how proud of me he is, how much he enjoys being stimulated by my mind. But when we're together, he treats me like a fool. This morning, he even argued with me about what I was having for breakfast. For Christ's sake, I've been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, but the guy who wants to marry me doesn't think I can order my own breakfast. They were standing in front of a large tank with crystal clear water. About half a dozen small whales were swimming in circles around the tank, occasionally going to the surface for air. You came and asked my opinion in the beginning, my young friend, he said quietly. And I told you that I thought your souls were not compatible. Do you remember what you said to me? Yes, she answered with a rueful smile. I asked you what the chief scientist of MOI could possibly know about souls. I'm sorry, Oscar. I was sorry at the time. I was so headstrong. Dale looked great on paper, and I wanted your approval. Forget it, he interrupted her. You know how I feel about you, but never underestimate a scientist. Some of them, he said abstractedly, want to know facts and concepts so that ultimately they can understand the overall nature of everything, including the putative soul. Now, take these whales, Oscar continued, increasing the tempo and adroitly changing the subject. We have been mapping their brains for almost a decade now, isolating various kinds of functions in specific locations and trying to correlate their brain structure with that of a human being. We have been reasonably successful. The language function that governs their singing has been separated, and the location of the physical controls for all parts of the body have been identified. In fact, we have found an area in the whale brain that corresponds to the equivalent function for every major capability in the human brain. But there's still a problem, a mystery, if you will. One of the whales stopped in its normal circuit about the tank. It seemed to be watching them. There's a large section of their brain that we have been unable to allocate to any specific function. A brilliant scientist years ago, after listening to the whales' songs while they were migrating and correlating those songs with the rest of their behavior, postulated that this large unmapped portion of their brain was a multi-dimensional memory array. His hypothesis was that the whales store entire incidents in that array, including sights, sounds, and even feelings, and that they relive these incidents during migration to alleviate the boredom. Our tests are starting to confirm his theory. Carol was intrigued. You mean they might put in that array the entire set of sensory impressions from something important, like calving, and then have, in a sense, a full instant replay during a particularly boring part of the migration route? Wow, That's fascinating. My memory irritates me all the time. It would be great if somehow I could go in there in a directed sense and pull out anything I want, complete with feelings. She laughed. There have been times in the summers when I couldn't remember exactly how great it felt to ski, and I have almost panicked, worrying about whether or not that feeling might be gone the next winter. Oscar waved at the whale, and it swam away. "Be careful," he said. "Other people have also thought that it would be fantastic if our memories were more complete, like a computer's. But suppose we did have a perfect multi-dimensional memory, like that hypothesized for the whale. And suppose we had the same lack of entry control that is characteristic of human memory as it now exists. You know, where what we remember and when we remember it are not under our individual control. Then there would be problems. We might even be non-functional as a species. A song, a picture, a smell, even the taste of a cake might suddenly force us to confront anew the full emotions associated with the death of a loved one. We might have to see again a painful fight between our parents, or even the trauma of our own birth." Oscar was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "Evolution has served us in good stead. It couldn't develop an entry control mechanism for our memories. So, to protect us, to keep us from being demolished by mistakes or past events, evolution built a natural fade process into our memories." "Carol Dawson! Carol Dawson! Report immediately to the audio-visual conference room adjacent to the director's office." The loudspeaker interrupted the quiet in the MOI aquarium. Carol gave Oscar a hug. "It's been great, Ozzy, as always," she said, watching him wince as she used her pet name for him. "But it looks like they've finished developing the pictures. Incidentally, I think the whole business about the whale's memories is fascinating. I want to come back and do a feature on it, maybe next week sometime. Give my love to your daughter and grandson." Carol had become so engrossed in the discussion with Oscar that she had momentarily forgotten why she had flown to Miami early that morning. Now she felt anew a keen sense of excitement as she drove back to the main MOI administrative building from the aquarium. Dale had been confident at breakfast that her eyes. She was wearing no makeup. She looked like a little girl except for the wrinkles on her face. "Are you still so angry, Nick, after all these years?" She came up next to him and smiled knowingly into his eyes. "I remember one night almost 5 years ago," she said playfully, "when you were not so angry. You were glad to see me. You asked me if I would have you for one night, no questions asked, and I agreed. You were great." In a momentary flash, Nick remembered the rainy night when he had stopped Greta just as she was leaving the pier. He recalled also how desperately he had needed to touch someone, anyone, on that particular night. "That was the day after my father's funeral," he said roughly, "and didn't mean shit anyway." He looked away. He did not want to return her piercing gaze. "That wasn't the impression I had," Greta continued in the same playful but otherwise emotionless tone. "I felt you inside me. I tasted your kisses. You can't tell me." "Look," interrupted Nick, clearly irritated. "What do you want? I don't want to stand here all morning arguing with you about some stupid night 5 years ago. Now I know that you're here for a reason. What is it?" Greta backed off a step, and her face hardened. "You are a very difficult man, Nick. It could be such fun doing business together if you weren't such a, pain in the ass." She stopped for a moment. "I have come from Homer. He has a proposition for you. He wants to see what you found yesterday in the ocean and maybe discuss a partnership." Side 5, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 116. Nick laughed triumphantly. "So, I was right all along. You were sent to find me. And now that bastard wants to discuss a partnership. Ha! Not a fucking chance. You won't steal from me again. Tell your employer or lover or whatever he is to cram his proposition up his ass. Now, if he'll excuse me." He started to walk around Greta and open his car door. Her strong hand grabbed his forearm. "You're making a mistake, Nick." Her eyes bored into his again. "A big mistake. You can't afford to do it on your own. What you found is probably worthless. If it is, let him spend the money." Her chameleon eyes shifted one more time. "And it would be such fun to work together again." Nick climbed into his car and turned on the engine. "No dice, Greta. You're wasting your time. Now I've got to go." He backed out of the parking place and then drove into the narrow street. The treasure was front and center in his mind again. He had been momentarily depressed by what Amanda had told him about the trident, but the fact that Homer wanted to see it gave Nick a feeling of power. But, he asked himself, how does he know already? Who talked? Or could someone have seen us? 5. When Commander Winters returned to his office after a scheduled meeting with the Public Relations Department, his secretary, Dora, was conspicuously reading the Key West newspaper. "Ahem," she said, deliberately attracting his attention. "Is the Vernon Winters starring in The Night of the Iguana at the Key West Playhouse tonight anyone I know? Or are there two of them in this town?" He laughed. He liked Dora. She was almost 60, black, a grandmother more than a dozen times, and one of the few secretaries on the base who actually had some pride in her work. She treated everybody, including Commander Winters, like one of her children. "So why didn't you tell me?" she said with feigned outrage. "After all, what if I had missed it altogether? I told you last year to make certain that you always told us when you were performing." He took her hand and gave it a little squeeze. "I had intended to tell you, Dora, but somehow it just slipped my mind. And you know that my thespian activities are not exactly embraced by the Navy, so I don't ballyhoo them about so much. But I'll have some tickets for you and your husband in a couple of weeks." He looked at the stack of message notes on her desk. "That many, huh? And I was only gone a little over 2 hours. It never rains, but it pours." "2 of these are supposedly urgent." Dora looked at her watch. "A Miss Dawson from the Miami Herald will call back in about 5 minutes, and that Lieutenant Todd has been calling all morning. He insists that he must see you before lunch, or he can't be properly prepared for the meeting this afternoon. Apparently he left a long message on your top-secret telemail sometime this morning. Right now he's furious with me because I wouldn't interrupt your meetings to tell you about his message. Is it really that important?" Commander Winters shrugged his shoulders and opened the door to his office. "I wonder what Todd wants," he thought. "I guess I should have checked my telemail before running off to the meeting with the chief." "Did you put all the rest of the messages on the computer?" he asked Dora before he closed the door. She nodded. "Okay, I'll talk to Miss Dawson when she calls. Tell Todd that I will see him in 15 minutes. He sat down at his desk and turned on his computer. He activated his telemail subdirectory and saw that he had 3 new entries already this morning, one in the top-secret queue. Commander Winters identified himself, entered the top-secret code word, and started to read Lieutenant Todd's transmission. The phone rang. After a few seconds, Dora buzzed him and told him that it was Miss Dawson. Before they started, Commander Winters agreed that the interview could be on the video phone and that it could be taped. He recognized Carol immediately from her occasional appearances on television. She explained to him that she was using the communications facility at the Miami International Airport. "Commander Winters," she said, wasting no time, "we have an uncorroborated report that the Navy is engaged in a search for something important and secret in the Gulf of Mexico between Key West and the Everglades. Your press people and Lieutenant Todd have both denied the report and referred all questions to you. Our source also told us, and we have subsequently verified both of these facts, that there are today a large number of technology ships sailing in the Gulf, and that you have been trying to rent sophisticated ocean telescopes from the Miami Oceanographic Institute. Do you have any comment?" "Certainly, Miss Dawson." The commander wore his best acting smile. He had carefully rehearsed the response in his morning meeting with the Admiral. "It's really amazing how rumors fly, particularly when someone suspects the Navy of nefarious deeds." He chuckled. All the activity is just preparation for some routine maneuvers next week. A few of the sailors who man the technology ships are a little rusty and wanted some practice this week. As for the MOI telescopes, we intended to use them in our maneuvers to check their value in assessing underwater threats. He looked directly at the camera. That's it, Miss Dawson. There's nothing special going on. Carol watched the commander on the monitor at the airport. She had expected someone with an imposing air of authority. This man had a softness in his eyes, some kind of sensitivity that was unusual in a career military officer. Carol had a sudden idea. She walked up close to her own camera. "Commander Winters," she said pleasantly, "let me ask you a hypothetical question. If the Navy were testing a new kind of missile and one test flight went astray, possibly even threatening population centers, wouldn't it be likely that the Navy, claiming national security reasons as its defense, would deny that such a thing had happened?" For a fleeting fraction of a second, the expression in the eyes of Commander Winters wavered. He looked shocked. Then he regained control. "It is difficult to answer such a hypothetical question," he intoned formally. "But I can tell you that it is Navy policy to keep the public informed about its activities. Only when the flow of information to the public could significantly undermine our national security would any kind of censorship take place." The interview wound up quickly. Carol had accomplished her objective. "Damn," said Commander Winters to himself as Dora announced that Lieutenant Todd was waiting to see him. "I should have expected that question. But how did she know that? Did she somehow trick Todd or one of the other officers? Or did someone in Washington spill the beans?" Winters opened the door to his office, and Lieutenant Todd nearly stormed into the room. With him was another tall young lieutenant, thick-shouldered with a bushy mustache, whom Todd introduced as Lieutenant Ramirez of the Naval Intelligence Division. "Did you read my telemail message?" "What did you think? My God, it's almost unbelievable what these Russians have done. I had no idea they could be so clever." Todd was almost shouting as he paced excitedly around the office. Winters watched Todd jumping around the room. This young lieutenant, he thought, is in a big hurry to get somewhere. His impatience is oozing out of every pore. But what in the world is he saying about the Russians? And why is this Mexican muscle man here with him? "Sit down, please," the commander replied, motioning at the two chairs opposite his desk. He looked sternly at Lieutenant Todd. "And start by explaining why Lieutenant Ramirez is here. You know the regulations. We were all briefed on them again last week. Only officers at the rank of commander or higher can authorize sharing information on a need-to-know basis." Todd immediately defended himself against the reproach. "Commander Winters, sir," he replied, "I believe that what we have here is a major international incident, far too big to be handled by special projects and systems engineering alone. I left word on your telemail interrupt at 0830 this morning for you to contact me ASAP that there was a significant new development in the Broken Arrow project. When I had not heard from you by 1000, even though I had tried several additional times to reach you by telephone, I became worried that we might be losing valuable time. I then contacted Ramirez so that he and his men could start their work." Todd stood up from his chair. "Sir," he began again, the excitement rising in his voice, "maybe I didn't make it clear enough in my telemail message. We have hard evidence that someone commanded the Panther to go astray right after the APRS was activated. We have confirmed from a special manual search of the intermittent telemetry data that the command receipt counters went crazy during a 2-second period just before the missile veered off course." "Calm down, Lieutenant Todd, and sit down again." Winters was irritated, not just by Todd's nonchalant dismissal of the regulations issue, but also by his undisguised accusation that Winters had been delinquent in responding to his messages. The commander's day had begun with a meeting with the admiral who ran the air station. He had wanted a briefing on all this Broken Arrow business. So Winters had not even been in his office except for a couple of minutes until after he came back from the Public Relations Department. When Todd was again seated, Winters continued carefully. "Now spare me the hysteria and your personal conclusions. I want you to give me the facts, only the facts, slowly and without prejudice. The accusations you made a few moments ago are very, very serious. In my eyes, if you have jumped to unsubstantiated conclusions too quickly, your fitness as an officer may be in doubt. So start at the beginning." There was a flash of anger in the lieutenant's eyes, and then he opened his notebook. When he spoke, his voice was a monotone, carefully modulated to be free of all emotion. "At precisely 03:45 this morning," he began, "I was awakened by Ensign Andrews, who had been working most of the night on the telemetry dumps that we recalled both from the Canaveral station and the tracking ship near Bimini. His assignment had been to go through the scheduled sequence of events on board the Panther missile and determine from the scattered telemetry, if possible, if any anomalous events had occurred on board just before the missile went off course. We thought that this way we might have a chance to isolate the cause of the problem. Basically, Ensign Andrews was a detective. As you know, the data system is quite constrained by the limited downlink bandwidth. So the packets of telemetry data come out in a somewhat artificial way, meaning that many of the data values governing the behavior of the bird at the time it changed direction would not have been sent to the Earth until several minutes later, after the missile had gone awry, and the tracking stations had already dropped and regained lock a couple of times. Ensign Andrews showed me that in the intermittent data there were 4 discrete measurements taken from the command receipt counter, a simple buffer in the software that increments by 1 every time a new command message is correctly received by the missile. At first, we did not believe what we were seeing. We thought perhaps someone had made an error, or that the decommutation maps were wrong. But by 0700, we had both checked the values from the 2 tracking sites and verified that we were indeed looking at the correct channel. Commander, in the 1.7 seconds after the APRS was activated, the command receipt counter registered over 300 new messages, and then the missile swerved away from its intended target. The commander was writing in a small spiral notebook while Todd was talking. It took him almost half a minute to finish his notes. Then he looked up at Todd and Ramirez. "Am I to believe, then," he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm, "that this is the entire data set upon which you wish to base your indictment of the Soviet Union and put our Navy intelligence community on alert? Or is there something else?" Todd looked confused. "You think it's more likely," Commander Winters continued, his voice now rising, "that the Russians knew the code for the command test set and transmitted 300 messages in less than 2 seconds, exactly at the right time, and from somewhere off the Florida coast, than it is that somewhere in the 4.2 software system there is an error that is improperly incrementing the command receipt counter? My God, Lieutenant, use your head. Are you seeing boogeymen at night? This is 1994. There is virtually no tension on the international scene. You believe that the Russians are so colossally stupid that they would risk détente to command a Navy cruise missile off course while it is still under test? Even if they could somehow command the missile to a specific location and then recover it and understand it thoroughly by reverse engineering, why would they take such a horrendous chance for such a comparatively small return? Todd and Ramirez said nothing during the commander's harangue. Ramirez was starting to look uncomfortably embarrassed toward the end. Todd's boyish self-confidence had faded as well, and he began to wring his hands and pop his knuckles absent-mindedly. After a long pause, Winters continued, firmly but without some of the exasperation of his initial speech. "We assigned some specific work items yesterday, Lieutenant. They were supposed to be addressed by today. Look again at the 4.2 software, particularly to see if there were any errors in the interface with the command test set that showed up during module or integration testing. Maybe there was a bug in the command receipt counter subroutine that did not get corrected in the new release. And for the meeting this afternoon, I want you to show me a list of possible failure modes that would explain the telemetry data, other than commands being sent from a foreign power. And then show what you were planning to do to analyze each failure mode and reduce the length of the list." Ramirez stood up to leave. Under the circumstances, Commander, I feel that my presence here is a little, improper. I have briefed a couple of my men already and have kicked off some investigative work to see if there is now or has been recently any Russian military or civilian activity in the area. I had put it as a computer game. I've been working on it for almost 2 years, and you are going to be the first outsider to play it. Nick screwed up his face as if he had just eaten a particularly tart piece of grapefruit. Moi? He exclaimed. You want me to play a computer game? You want me, whose hand-eye coordination is almost non-existent, even when completely sober, to sit down and shoot aliens or dodge bombs or roll marbles at a frenzied pace that only neo-adolescents can enjoy? Jefferson, have you lost your mind? This is Nick Williams, the guy you call the professor, the man who sits and reads books for entertainment. Very, very good, Troy replied, laughing heartily at Nick's outburst. You're perfect as an alpha tester. My game is not one of those arcade games that test your reflexes, although there are a few places in the game where the pace is fairly fast. My creation is an adventure game. It's a little like a novel, except that the player defines the outcome of the game. I'm aiming at a wide audience, and I'm including a lot of unusual technological wrinkles. I would love to see how you respond. Troy took Nick's shrug as grudging assent and opened the door to what should have been the master bedroom in the duplex unit. Instead, what greeted Nick's eyes was an almost phantasmagoric collection of electronic equipment filling every nook and cranny of a fairly large room. His first impression was one of total chaos. But after shaking his head and blinking a couple of times, Nick could make out some order in the jumble of scopes, monitors, cables, computers, and sundry unattached parts. On one side of the room was a chair about 10 feet in front of a giant screen. Between this chair and the screen was a low table with a keyboard on it. Troy motioned to Nick to sit down. My game is called Alien Adventure, Troy said excitedly. And it will start as soon as I boot the disks, and you are ready at the keyboard. But there are some things that I must tell you first before you start. He knelt beside Nick and pointed at the keyboard. There are 3 critical keys for you to remember while you are playing the game. First, the X key stops the clock. From the moment you start the game, the clock continues to run. While the clock is running, you are consuming vital resources. There is only this one way to stop the clock and gather your wits without paying a penalty. Hitting the X key allows you to stop and think. Even more important than the X is the S key. The S allows you to checkpoint, or, as you would say, save the game. Right now you can't understand what I'm telling you because you haven't played complicated computer games before. But believe me, you must learn regularly to save the game. When you hit the S key, all the parameters of the game you are playing are written into a special database that has a unique identifier. Then, at any time in the future, you can call that identifier and the game will restart in exactly the place where you saved it. This feature can be a lifesaver. If you take a risky route in the game and your character ends up dying, it's the save game feature that keeps you from having to start all over again. Nick was amazed. This was a different Troy than he had ever seen before. True, he had been a little surprised and considerably impressed by his first mate's ability to fix virtually any piece of electronic gear on the boat, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that Troy left the boat and went home to work with similar parts in a much more creative way. Now this same smiling black man had him sitting in a chair in front of a giant screen and was lecturing him patiently like a child. Nick could hardly wait to see what would happen next. Finally, Troy said, asking with his eyes if Nick was still following him, there's the H, or help key. When you simply have run out of imagination and don't know what to do, you can push H. The game will then give you some hints on how you might proceed. But I must warn you of one thing. The clock continues to run while you are being helped. And there are some places in the game, during a battle, for instance, where pushing the H key can be disastrous because you are essentially defenseless during the time that the game processes your request for help. H is most useful when you are in a benign spot and trying to figure out your overall strategy. Still squatting beside him, Troy handed Nick a small spiral notebook and motioned for him to open it. The first page said Command Dictionary. On each page was a separate entry, legibly written by hand, that explained the game command that would result from hitting the key listed at the top of the page. "Here are the rest of your commands, 50 in all," Troy said. "But you don't need to memorize them. I'll help you. You'll learn some of them yourself after you play the game for a while. Most of the important commands are activated by a single stroke on the keyboard, but some of the commands require 2 entries. Nick flipped through the notebook. He noted that the key L prompted the command look, but another entry was necessary to identify what instrument was being used to look. L, followed by a 1, for example, meant to look with your eyes. L8 meant to look with an ultraviolet spectrometer, whatever that was. Nick was already overwhelmed. He looked over at his friend, who was busy making final checks on some equipment. Troy came back to the chair and looked down at Nick. "Now," he said, "I think you're ready. Any questions?" "Just one, my lord and guide," Nick replied with mock meekness. "May I please have another beer before I risk my manhood in some weird world of your creation?" Actually, Nick was not yet ready to play the game. Even after Troy booted 3 compact discs, there were more preliminary activities before Nick could begin the game itself. He had to enter his name, race, age, and sex in response to questions that appeared on the giant screen. Nick looked at Troy with a curious tilt of his head and a weird expression on his face. "Don't ask questions at this point," Troy told him. "It will all be clear soon enough." The screen next was filled with a beautiful ringed planet that looked like what an artist who favored purple might make out of Saturn. The perspective was from the pole of the planet. The rings were all displayed like the different sections of a dart target. Little flecks of light gleamed intermittently from the rings, indicating that the sun or star, or whatever was the source for the reflected light, was in the vicinity of the viewer. It was a lovely picture. A simple credit in block titles, Alien Adventure by Troy Jefferson, was superimposed on the ringed planet for 3 or 4 seconds, and the sound of soft classical music could be heard in the room. Nick resisted an urge to chuckle when he heard Troy's voice, clearly serious and self-conscious, coming from one of the speakers. Troy's recorded voice explained the initial conditions for the game. The adventurer was on a space station in polar orbit around Gunna, the largest planet belonging to another solar system whose central body was the G-type star that we call Tau Ceti, only 10 light-years or so away from the Earth. Tau Ceti has 8 primary bodies in its system, Troy's voice said, including 6 planets and 2 moons. Maps of the system are available at the commissary on the space station, Troy's voice continued, although some of the regions have been incompletely mapped. When your adventure begins, you are sleeping in your cabin on board the station. An alarm sounds on your personal receiver. The voice faded, and the sound of an alarm could be heard. The picture on the giant screen was the inside of a space cabin, almost certainly taken from one of the many successful science fiction movies. In the upper right-hand corner of the screen was a game digital clock that was changing by 1 unit every 4 seconds or so. Nick looked helplessly at Troy. Troy suggested that he hit the L key. In a few seconds, Nick learned that he could use the direction keys on the board to look at specific items in his cabin. Each time he hit a direction key, the picture on the screen chipped down on one of the easy chairs and beat his chest. "You're crazy, Jefferson," Nick said, watching Troy's display. "I don't know if I can ever again be alone with you on a boat. You are a certified nutcase. I mean, just imagine the reviews. Alien Adventure features an encounter with Susie Q, the queen of pornography, in an underground castle on the asteroid Vit. Which reminds me, how in the world did you get all those movie pieces in there?" "Lots of research and hard work, Professor," Troy answered, starting to calm down a little. "Lanny and 3 of his friends have spent maybe 1,000 hours watching film for me, trying to find exactly the right clips. And none of this would be possible, of course, without the new data storage methods. We can now store an excellent digital version of every movie ever made in the United States in a warehouse not much larger than this duplex. I've just used database capabilities to the fullest. Nick crushed a beer can in his hands. It's fabulous. Really. But I don't know about the sex business. And why do you have the player register his race at the beginning of the game? Don't you think that will offend some people? I never saw anything in the game that was based on the racial information. Even though he was drunk, Troy became momentarily serious and almost somber. Look, man, he said firmly, sex and race are both a part of life. It may be true that people play computer games primarily for entertainment, and that they would prefer not to be confronted by some topics when they are amusing themselves, but I must be allowed some creative license. Race is with us every day, and ignoring it, it seems to me, only contributes to the problem. Troy brightened up. Hey, Professor, that lizard man who warned you on Thenia was black. You went ahead anyway, despite his warning. What if he had been white? Would you have turned around and gone back to the shuttle? A black man playing the game encounters a white lizard man on Thenia. It's part of the show, man. There are 20 or so changes in the scenario that are based on racial input. Nick's expression was clearly disbelieving. Really, Troy said, standing up to return to the room where they had played his game. I'll show you. Watch how the game starts if you register that you are a black male. Nick followed Troy back into the computer room. His curiosity was clearly piqued. Troy turned the game on, and Nick entered the biographical data, changing his race to black. This time, when the television picture in his space station cabin came into focus, Princess Heather was black. The princess this time was, in fact, Angie Leatherwood. Well, I'll be damned, Nick said, looking over at a beaming Troy. You are one clever dude, Mr. Jefferson. Nick walked out of the room whistling and shaking his head again. Troy turned off the game and followed. Okay, Nick began, once they were back in Troy's living room and seated on the couch. One last question, and then let's forget the game for the time being. How did you get my name into it? I thought that was very impressive. It was originally Lanny's idea, based on a movie he watched about a speech therapist. Lanny had all the minor characters spend a day mouthing all the vowel and consonant sounds in a test session. Then we just put the sounds together with what are called audio-analytic continuation techniques. Troy laughed. He was feeling ebullient and basking in the compliments. But it does have its drawbacks. Our interpreter only knows how to read simple English words. We may have to suppress that feature if we sell the game abroad. Nick stood up. Well, I've run out of superlatives. By the way, are there more of you, brothers, sisters, anything? I guess I'd like to warn the rest of the world. Only me now, Troy replied, a faraway look fleetingly crossing his face. I had a brother, Jamie, 6 years older than me. We were very close. He died in an automobile accident when I was 14. There was an awkward silence. I'm sorry, Nick said, again touched by Troy's openness. Troy shrugged his shoulders and struggled with the sudden memory. Nick changed the subject. They talked about the boat and then about Homer and his crew for several minutes. Suddenly, Nick looked at his watch. Jesus Christ, he said, it's after 4 o'clock. Weren't we supposed to meet Carol Dawson at 4? Troy jumped out of his chair. We sure were. Some partners we turned out to be. He was grinning again, spending the entire afternoon drinking beer and playing games. The two men shared a small hug, threw the empty beer cans in the trash, and went out the door toward Nick's car. 7. Carol was clearly irritated as she sat in the communications room at the Marriott. She was drumming her fingers on the desk while she listened to the telephone ring. There was a click, and then Nick's voice said, I am not at home at the present time, but if... She flipped the switch off hastily and completed the sentence, her sardonic mimicry releasing some of her frustration. But if you'll leave your name, your number, and the time that you called, I'll get back to you as soon as I return. S-H-I-T. Shit. I knew I should have called before I left Miami. She dialed another number. Bernice answered and put her right through on video to Dr. Dale Michaels. Carol did not bother with a greeting. Can you believe that I can't even find the stupid bastard? He's not on his boat. He's not at home. Nobody knows where he is. I could have stayed in Miami and taken a nap. Carol had not told Dr. Dale much about Nick and Troy, and what she had said about Nick had not been flattering. "Well, what did you expect?" Dale responded. "You wanted to go out with amateurs as a cover. Why would you think that he would be easy to find before your appointment? That kind usually stays in bed with his dame of the day until he has some reason to greet the world." Dale chuckled to himself. Carol found herself strangely annoyed by Dale's disdainful comment about Nick's love life. She started to say something, but decided against it. "Say, Dale," she said instead, "is this phone line absolutely secure? I have a couple of sensitive items to discuss with you." He smiled. "Nothing to worry about. I have sensors that flash if there is the slightest unexplained break anywhere in the line, even on your end." "Good," Carol replied. She pulled out her notebook and scanned a handwritten list. "As far as Arnie Weber knows," she said, looking up at the video camera, "there are no legal prohibitions against salvaging any U.S. government property, provided it is returned to its rightful owner very soon after its retrieval. So I wouldn't technically be committing a crime if I pull the missile up." She checked the first item off her list. "But, Dale, I thought about something else on the flight down here from Miami. This thing is, after all, some kind of guided missile. What if it blows up? Am I crazy to worry about such a thing? Or is it somehow incapacitated or whatever by sitting down there in the sand and salt water for several days?" Dale laughed. "Sometimes, Carol, you're divine. I am fairly confident that the new missile is designed to operate either in the air or in water. And I don't think that the sand would be able to foul up its critical parts in a short period of time. However, the fact that it hasn't exploded yet suggests to me that it probably wasn't armed in the first place, except possibly for a small destruct device that may or may not have already failed. You were taking a calculated risk in retrieving that missile. I still strongly suggest that you make your dive, obtain the photographs, and then go public with the story. Dredging the missile up for display purposes seems to me to be more of a stunt than journalism. Besides, it's dangerous." Carol was curt. "As I said in the car, you are entitled to your opinion. The Navy could make a case that I faked the pictures somehow, but they cannot argue with a missile that has physics tomorrow." "Angie Leatherwood is a friend of yours?" Carol said, obviously impressed. "I haven't seen her since she made the big time." She paused for a second and handed the envelope to Nick. "Look at these images in private. The whole set was taken just under the boat where we were diving. Some are obviously blow-ups of others. It may take a little time for your eyes to adjust to all the colors, but it's the brown object or objects that we're after." Carol could tell that both of the men were eager to see the pictures. She walked with them toward Nick's car. "So I'll see both of you tonight at Sloppy Joe's about 10:15. She turned to head for her own parking place. Carol, just a minute." Nick stopped her. Carol waited while Nick, suddenly awkward, tried to figure out a nice way to ask his question. "Would you mind telling us why you were talking to Captain Homer?" he at last said tactfully. Carol looked at Nick and Troy for a minute and then laughed. "I ran into him while I was in the office trying to call you guys. He wanted to know about the piece we retrieved yesterday. I put him off the track by telling him I was doing a feature article on all members of the crew that found the Santa Rosa treasure 8 years ago." Nick glanced at Troy with mock disgust. "You see, Jefferson," he said with exaggerated emphasis, "I told you there was a legitimate explanation." The two men waved at Carol as she headed for her car. 8. "Lieutenant Todd," the commander said with exasperation, "I am beginning to think that the U.S. Navy has overestimated your intelligence or experience or both. It is beyond me how you can continue even to consider the possibility that the Panther was commanded off course by the Russians, particularly in light of the new information you presented this afternoon." But, sir, the younger man answered stubbornly, it is still a viable hypothesis, and you yourself said in the meeting that a good failure analysis does not exclude any reasonable possibility. The two men were in Commander Winter's office. The commander walked over to look out the window. It was almost dark outside. The air was heavy, still, and humid. Thunderstorms were building over the ocean to the south. The base was nearly empty. At length, Winters looked at his watch, heaved a sigh, and came back across the room towards Lieutenant Todd. He was smiling only slightly. You listened well, Lieutenant, but the operative word here is reasonable. Let's review the facts. Did I or did I not hear correctly that your telemetry analysis unit found this afternoon that the commands rejected counter on the bird also incremented during the flight, beginning as early as off the coast of New Brunswick? And that apparently over 1,000 command messages were rejected as the missile made its way down the Atlantic coast. How do you propose to explain all this in terms of your scenario? Did the Russians deploy an entire fleet of ships along the flight path just to confuse and capture one solitary Navy test missile? Commander Winters was now standing directly in front of the taller young lieutenant. Or maybe you believe, he continued sarcastically, before Todd could respond, that the Russians have a new secret weapon that flies alongside a missile going at Mach 6 and talks to it en route. Come on, Lieutenant. On what reasonable grounds do you consider this bizarre Russian hypothesis of yours still viable? Lieutenant Todd did not yield. Sir, he answered, none of the other possible explanations for the missile's behavior makes any more sense at this stage. You now say that you believe it's a software problem. However, our very brightest programmers cannot imagine how the only external indication of a major system-level software malfunction could be that two, and only two, command counters go haywire. They have checked all the internal software diagnostic data that was telemetered to the ground, and they can find no problems. Besides, the pre-release checkout indicates that all the software was working fine just seconds before the flight began. And we know something else. Ramirez has learned from Washington that there had been peculiar movements in the Russian submarine fleet off the Florida coast in the last 48 hours. I'm not saying that the Russian hypothesis, as you call it, is the answer. Just that until we have a more satisfactory explanation of a failure mechanism that could cause both command counters to increment, it makes sense to carry one option that assumes maybe the Panther was actually commanded. Winters shook his head. All right, Lieutenant, he said finally. I will not order you to take it off the list, but I will order you to concentrate this weekend on finding the missile in the ocean somewhere and identifying a hardware and or software problem that could have caused either the command counter anomaly or the change in the flight path or both. There must be an explanation that does not involve operations on a massive scale by the Russians. Todd started to walk around Winters and leave. Just a minute, the commander said, his eyes narrowing. I don't believe it's necessary, is it, Lieutenant, to remind you of who will be held responsible if the outside world gets wind of this Russian business? No, Commander, sir, was the answer. Then carry on, said Winters, and let me know if there are any significant new developments. Commander Winters was in a hurry. He had called the theater right after Todd had left and told Melvin Burton that he was going to be late. He drove quickly into a hamburger stand, wolfed down a burger and fries, and headed for the marina area. He arrived at the theater when most of the rest of the cast was already dressed. Melvin met him at the door. Quickly now, Commander. We have no time to spare. The makeup must be correct the first time. He looked nervously at his watch. You're in the pulpit in exactly 42 minutes. The commander entered the men's dressing room, took off his Navy uniform, and put on the dour black and white regalia of an Episcopal priest. Outside the door to the dressing room, Melvin paced back and forth, going through a final checklist in his mind. Commander Winters was in the pulpit when the curtain rose. He had a strong case of normal opening night jitters. He looked across the 3 rows of his stage congregation to the full audience in the theater. He saw his wife, Betty, and son Hap on the second row. Winters smiled at them quickly before the applause died down. Then his nervousness disappeared as he launched into Shannon's sermon. The short prologue sped by quickly. The lights dimmed another time for 15 seconds. The set changed automatically, and he was in the final scene, walking into his hotel room in Mexico and still mumbling to himself phrases from his letter. Shannon Winters sat down on his bed. He heard a noise in the corner of the room and looked up. It was Charlotte Tiffany. Her gorgeous auburn hair was down over her shoulders. She was wearing a light blue silk nightshirt, cut low in the middle, which her ample and upright breasts filled completely. He heard her say, "Larry, oh Larry, finally we're alone together." And she came to sit beside him on the bed. Her perfume filled his nostrils. Her hand was behind his head. Her lips pressed against his, insistent, hard, searching. He pulled back. Her lips followed, then her body. He fell back on the bed. She crawled on top, her kisses continuing, her breasts pushed against his pounding chest. He put his arms around her, slowly at first, and then, lying on his back, he enveloped her with a deep embrace.
Side 6, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 143. The lights flashed off and on for several seconds. Charlotte Tiffany slid off of Winters and lay beside him on the bed. He could hear her labored breathing. A voice was heard. "Charlotte?" Then again, with a loud knock on the door. "Charlotte, I know you're in there." The door sprang open. The two lovers half sat up in bed. The lights went off and the curtain came down. The applause was loud and sustained. Commander Vernon Winters pushed open the door and stumbled outside. He was at the alley entrance to the theater. The door, over which was a single light bulb covered with insects, opened onto a small wooden platform a few steps above the pavement. Winters walked down the 3 steps and stood beside the red brick wall of the theater. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it. He watched the smoke curl upward against the red brick. In the distance, there was a burst of lightning, then a pause before the sound of rolling thunder. He inhaled deeply again and tried to understand what he had been feeling during those 5 or 10 seconds with Tiffany. I wonder if they could tell, he thought. I wonder if it was obvious to everyone. When he had changed clothes for the first full act of the play, he had noticed the telltale tracks on his undershorts. He expelled some more smoke and winced. And that little girl, my God, she knows for sure. She must have felt it when she was on top of me. Despite himself, he recaptured for an instant his excitement when Tiffany had pressed herself against him. His breath shortened. A first tinge of guilt began to manifest itself. My God, he thought again. What am I? I'm a dirty old man. For some reason, he found himself thinking of Joanna Carr, of a night almost 25 years ago. He remembered the moment when he took her. "Commander," he heard a voice say. He turned around. Tiffany was standing on the platform in her T-shirt and jeans, her long hair down over her shoulders. Now she was walking down the steps toward him. "Commander," she said again with a mysterious smile, "may I have a cigarette?" He was dumbfounded, stupefied. He said nothing. Winters automatically reached into his pocket and pulled out his pack of Pall-Malls. The girl took one, packed it against her fingernail, and slid it into her mouth. She waited a second, maybe 2. Then she gave him another smile. Winters at last woke up and produced his cheap supermarket lighter. She cupped his trembling hand and inhaled vigorously on the cigarette. Winters watched her, fascinated, as she pulled the smoke into her lungs. He studied her mouth, her white neck, her uplifted chest as she caressed the smoke. With the same rapt attention, he watched her diaphragm subside and the smoke curl out of her pursed lips. They stood there together, quietly smoking, neither speaking. Over the ocean, there was another flash of lightning, another roll of thunder. Each time that Tiffany would put the cigarette in her mouth, the mesmerized Winters would follow her every move. She would inhale deeply, intently, pulling hard on the cigarette for the nicotine her body cherished. He was only vaguely aware of his jumbled thoughts. She's beautiful, so beautiful, young and fresh and full of life. And that hair. How I would love to wrap it around my neck. But she's not a little girl. She's a young woman. She must sense what I'm feeling, my fascination for her. She smokes as I do. With complete concentration, she caresses. I love stormy nights. Tiffany broke the silence as still another distant flash of lightning lit up the sky. She moved closer to him, and then craned her neck to see around a group of trees that was blocking her view of the cloud formation where the lightning was occurring. She brushed against Commander Winters ever so slightly. He was electrified. His mouth was dry. His body was suffused with desire, a desire he barely recognized. He could not answer her comment. Instead, he stared off at the growing storm and took the final drag from his cigarette. She too finished her cigarette and dropped it on the pavement. As she turned to face him and their eyes met, the last wisps of smoke were playfully wandering across her lips. She gave a quick, flirtatious blow with her mouth, and Winters felt a burst of lust in his groin. He retained his self-control, and they entered the theater in silence. The applause continued. Commander Winters brought the women who had played Maxine and Hannah, one on either side of him, forward for their final bow, just as they had planned before the performance began. The applause intensified. Again he stared at the empty seats where Betty and Hap had been before the intermission. He heard a voice from the audience shout, "Charlotte Goodall," and Winters improvised. He took the two ladies back to the line of the assembled cast and walked down the line to Tiffany. For a moment she did not understand. Then her face broke into a radiant smile, and she took his hand. He walked forward with her to the front of the stage, their hands wrapped together in a tight hold. This was her special moment. She was near tears as she heard the applause grow again. He stood aside, and she bowed gracefully to the audience. She finished her bow, took his hand again with a delightful squeeze, and backed up into the line with the cast. Melvin, Mark, and Amanda were all backstage while they were dressing. Enthusiastic congratulations were everywhere. Melvin particularly seemed ecstatic. He admitted that he had had some misgivings during rehearsals, but that everyone had been wonderful. The director confided to Winters that the bedroom scene with Tiffany had been superb, couldn't have been better, as Melvin literally danced out the dressing room door. Winters was overwhelmed with a myriad of emotions. He was pleased with his performance in the play and the audience reception, but other more personal things were on his mind. What had happened to Betty and Hap? Why had they left at intermission? In his mind's eye, Winters imagined Betty watching his love scene with Tiffany. He had a momentary panic as he convinced himself that she had known from out in the audience that her husband was not acting at all, that he was every bit as aroused as the character he was playing. What had occurred with Tiffany he could not begin to understand, and could not even think about without starting to feel guilty. While he was putting back on his Navy uniform, he allowed himself to taste again her kisses on the bed in the play, and to feel the sexual tension while they smoked together in the alley. But beyond his awareness of his arousal, he would not go. Guilt was a depressing emotion, and on his successful opening night, he did not want to be depressed. When Commander Winters walked out of the men's communal dressing room, Tiffany was waiting for him. Her hair was back in pigtails, her face scrubbed free of makeup. She looked again like a little girl. "Commander," she said, almost with servility, "would you do me a favor, please?" He smiled his assent. She beckoned to him, and he followed her out in a hall that was adjacent to the backstage quarters. A red-haired man about the commander's age was standing in the hall, nervously smoking a cigarette and pacing. It was obvious that he felt uncomfortable and out of place. Next to him was a tawdry brunette, early 30s perhaps, chewing gum and talking to the man in a whisper. The man noticeably relaxed when he saw the commander in his uniform. "Well, sir," he said to Winters when Tiffany introduced him as her father, "it's good to meet you. I don't know much about this acting business, but I worry that it's unhealthy for my daughter sometimes." He winked at his wife. Tiffany's stepmother, and lowered his voice. "You know, sir, with all the wimps and fags and other weirdo actors, a man can't be too careful. But Tiff told me there was a real Navy officer, a bona fide commander, as part of the cast. At first I didn't believe her." Mr. Thomas was definitely getting signals both from Tiffany and his wife. He was talking too much. "I'm regular Navy myself," he blurted a barrier. Eventually, a thin black rod, a probe of some kind, thrust through the surface into the emerald ocean. A second probe becomes visible, then a third. Both long black rods like the first one, but each equipped with strikingly different apparatus scattered along the length of the rod. Something larger pushes against the membrane, once, twice, then finally breaking through. But a strange contraption. It's an aerodynamic shape about 3 inches long and 2 separate segments with a joint between them. The forebody is a nose cone. The afterbody is long and slender and tapers to a point. In addition to the 3 probes on the front of its forebody, it has 4 other furlable appendages or arms, 2 connected to the side of each segment. It swims over to a nearby underwater plant with its arms stored next to its smooth body. There it unfurls the multifaceted appendages and begins to examine the plant. An astonishing array of tiny instruments studies the plant for a few moments, and then the entity moves away. The same procedure is repeated with each plant encountered. Eventually, the thing finds a plant that it likes, and its pincers remove a major leaf. The leaf is neatly folded into a smaller volume and is then carried back to the object with a golden membrane. The strange forager is joined by a partner, a carbon copy of itself, and by 2 fat fish with multiple arms and legs. The latter pair scuttle off to the side and begin modifying the ocean floor. Days pass. The things with the probes work ceaselessly, bringing more and more varieties of plant and animal life back to the home base. The legged fish, meanwhile, have constructed, out of available sand, rocks, shells, and living creatures, almost 1,000 tiny sealed rectangular homes on the ocean floor. These fish entities, too, work without break. Their next task is to transport each of the red spots, one at a time, from the golden cradle to their new houses. If a microscope were available, it would show that some structure was already developing inside the red spots, giving them definition and distinction by the time of their initial transport. But they are still very, very small. Once the red spots and their gelatin protection are carefully implanted inside their tiny houses, the foragers make routine stops on each trip to deposit a portion of their harvest. At the same time, the fish with legs, the architects and builders of the rectangular houses, begin working on transparent igloo-like homes for the embryos of another species. A year later, moonlight falls on the Emerald Lake. Several hundred eager, excited, wriggling necks, some royal blue and some pale blue, struggle upward to find the moon. Their heads pivot to face all directions, and maybe 24 separate indentations and orifices can be seen in each face. The necks crane this way, then that way. The silent serpents are searching for something. From the direction of the moon, a bizarre ship approaches on the water. It is large compared to the young serpents, its twin towers standing about 8 feet out of the water and about 6 feet above, on the average, a squarish platform 15 feet on a side that forms the bottom of the boat. The top surface of this platform is irregular, undulating, and cratered. The platform floats smoothly upon the water. The ship comes into the middle of the serpents and stops. The serpents divide into 2 groups according to the color of their necks, and then line up on either side of the ship in very orderly rows and columns. A single musical note, a B-flat with a flautish timbre, comes from the ship. Quickly the note is repeated up and down the rows and columns by each of the serpents on the 2 sides of the boat. Then a second note issues forth from the ship, also sounding like a flute, and the process repeats itself. For hours the music lesson continues, covering a range of both notes and chords, until some of the serpents on each side lose their voices. The exercise concludes with an attempted ensemble performance by the Royal Blue-Necked Serpents, but the result is a painful cacophony. Inside the ship, every note, every movement, every response by the juvenile serpents to the music lesson is carefully monitored and recorded. The ingenious engineering design of the boat is based upon the key controlling elements of the original cradle. However, although segments of gold metallic material, as well as the long black rods and even portions of the fat fish with legs, appear in the computer that runs the ship, the primary constituents of its mass are derived from great quantities of local rock and organic matter taken from the floor of the Emerald Lake. The ship is the quintessential music teacher, a virtually perfect synthesizer equipped with microprocessors that not only store all the responses of the pupils, but also contain software that will allow experimentation with a range of individualized methods of teaching. But this sophisticated robot, engineered by the artificial intelligence packed around the serpent zygotes and made almost entirely of chemical compounds extracted from material found in the neighborhood of the landing point, is itself being watched and studied from afar by test engineers. The current test is in its earliest stages and is progressing splendidly. This is the third different configuration tried for the music teacher, the hardest part of the design of the cradle that will carry the serpent zygotes back to Canther. The first was an abysmal failure. The embryos developed into adolescence all right, but the teacher was never able to instruct them well enough that they could sing the mating song and reproduce. The second design was better. It was able to teach the serpents to perform the courtship symphony, and a new generation of the species was produced. However, this next group of adult serpents was not able subsequently to teach their progeny to sing. The best of the bioengineering personnel in the colony were brought in to study this problem. After poring over quadrillions of bits of accumulated data associated with the development of the serpents and other related species, they found a curious correlation between the degree of nurturing provided by the parent and the resulting ability of that infant, upon reaching maturity, to teach its own offspring. The artificial intelligence package responsible for the first 6 months of serpent life was then redesigned to include a surrogate mother whose only purpose was to hold and cuddle the fledgling serpents at regular intervals. Subsystem tests proved successful. This slight alteration of the early nurturing protocol produced adult serpents that were able to teach their children to sing. This demonstration test lasts for more than 4 millicycles. At the end of the period, the test is declared an unqualified success. A strong, creative serpent population nearing 25,000 fills the artificial lake. Limitations to future growth are only test-related. Eventually, the test survivors are transported to another locale in the zoo complex, and the Canthorian serpents are added to the list of species ready for zygote repatriation. Saturday. 1. The full moon rises over the placid ocean. Troy stares at the moonbeams, watching them shimmer on the quiet water. Angie appears and stands in the water in front of him. She is wearing a skin-tight white bathing suit, one piece, and is submerged from the waist down. She beckons to him, and he walks across the damp sand toward the water. He is barefoot and is also wearing a white bathing suit. The water is surprisingly warm. Angie begins to sing. Her magnificent voice enfolds him as Troy draws nearer to her in the light surf. They touch and kiss. She pulls away and gives him a smile of encouragement. Troy feels himself becoming aroused. So he and Troy had installed the night before. Since they had used this old equipment several times on other excursions, the installation had been straightforward and without major problems. Carol climbed onto the boat and put her copy of the photos on top of the counter next to the steering wheel. "Where's the trident?" she called to Nick. "I thought I'd take another look at it this morning." "Bottom left drawer under the nav equipment," was his swift and sharp reply. She took the gray bag out of the drawer, opened it, and pulled out the golden trident. She held it by the long middle rod. It felt funny for some reason. Carol put the object back in the bag and pulled it out a second time. Again she held the heavy trident in her hands. It still didn't feel right. Carol remembered grasping the rod underneath the overhang in the water and wrapping her hand slowly around the central rod. "That's it," she said to herself. "It's thicker." She turned the object over in her hands. "What's the matter with me?" she thought. "Have I lost my mind? How could it be thicker?" She examined it one more time with great care. This time she thought that the individual tines of the fork had lengthened, and that she could detect a perceptible increase in the overall weight. Good grief! Can this be possible? She wondered. Carol pulled out the photos she had brought along. All the images of the trident that she had with her had been taken underwater, but she was certain that she could discern two subtle changes since it was first photographed. The axis rod did appear to be thicker, and the tines of the fork did indeed look longer. "Nick," she said in a loud voice. "Nick, can you come here?" "I'm right in the middle of something," an unfriendly voice responded from the other side of the canopy. "Is it important?" "No. I mean, yes," Carol answered. "But it can wait until your first available moment." Carol's mind was racing. "There are only two possibilities," she said to herself with logical precision. "Either it has changed, or it hasn't. If it hasn't changed, then I must be spooked. For it definitely seems thicker. But how could it change? Either on its own, or someone changed it. But who? Nick? But how could he?" Nick came up to her. "Yes," he said in a distant, almost hostile tone. He was obviously annoyed. Carol handed him the trident. "Well," she said, smiling and looking at him expectantly. "Well, what?" he answered, totally confused by what was happening and still angry about the earlier interaction. "Can you tell the difference?" Carol continued, nodding at the trident in his hand. Nick turned it upside down as she had done. The sunlight glinted off the golden surface and hurt his eyes. He squinted. Then he switched the object from hand to hand and looked at it from many different angles. "I think I'm lost," Nick said at length. "Are you trying to tell me there's some change in this thing?" He held it out between them. "Yes," she said. "Can't you feel it? The central rod's thicker than it was on Thursday, and the tines or individual elements of that fork on one end are a little longer. And don't you think the whole thing is heavier?" Nick's headache continued to throb. He looked back and forth between the trident and Carol. As far as he could tell, the object had not changed. "No, I don't," he said. "It seems the same to me." "You're just being difficult," Carol persisted, grabbing the trident back. "Here, look at the pictures. Check out the length of the fork there compared to the overall rod, and then look at it now. It's different." There was something in Carol's general attitude that really irritated Nick. She always seemed to assume that she was right and everyone else was wrong. "This is absurd," Nick nearly shouted in reply, "and I have a lot of work to do." He paused for a moment and then continued. "How the hell could it change? It's a metal object, for Christ's sake. What do you think? That somehow it grew? Shit." He shook his head and started to walk away. After a couple of steps, he turned around. "You can't trust the pictures anyway," he said in more measured tones. "Underwater photos always distort the objects." Troy was approaching with both the cart and Carol's equipment. He could tell from the body positions, even without hearing the words, that his two boatmates were at it again. My, he said as he walked up. "I can't leave you two alone for a minute. What are you fighting about this morning, Professor?" "The supposedly intelligent reporter friend of yours," Nick replied, looking at Carol and speaking in a patronizing manner, "insists that our trident has changed shape. Overnight, I guess, although she has not yet begun to explain how. Will you please, since she won't believe me, explain to her about the index of refraction or whatever it is that fouls up underwater pictures?" Carol appealed to Troy. "But it has changed, honest. I remember clearly what it felt like at first, and now it feels different. Troy was unloading the cart and putting the ocean telescope system on the Florida Queen. "Angel," Troy said, stopping to check the trident that she was extending toward him with both hands. "I can't tell whether it has changed or not, but I can tell you one thing. You were very excited when you found it the first time, and you were also underwater. With that combination, I wouldn't trust my own memory of how something felt." Carol looked at the two men. She was going to pursue the discussion, but Nick abruptly changed the subject. "Did you know, Mr. Jefferson, that our client, Miss Dawson, has requested your services as a diving partner today? She doesn't want to dive with me." His tone was now acerbic.
Side 7. Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 176. Troy looked at Carol with surprise. "That's real nice, Angel," he said quietly. "But Nick is really the expert. I'm just a little more than a beginner." "I know that," Carol responded brusquely, still chafing from the outcome of the previous conversation. "But I want to dive with someone I can trust, someone who behaves responsibly. I know enough about diving for both of us." Nick gave Carol an angry look and then turned and walked away. He was pissed. "Come on, Jefferson," he said. "I've already agreed to let Miss High and Mighty have her way. This time. Let's get the boat ready and finish setting up that telescope thing of hers again." "My father finally divorced my mother when I was 10, Carol was saying to Troy. They were sitting together in the deck chairs at the front of the boat. After they had gone over the procedures for the dive a couple of times, Carol had mentioned something about her first boating experience, a birthday on a fishing boat with her father when she was 6, and the two of them had moved comfortably into a discussion of their childhood. The breakup was awful. She handed the can of Coke back to Troy. "I think you might have been luckier in some ways never to have known your father." "I doubt it," Troy replied seriously. "From my earliest days, I resented the fact that some of the kids had two parents. My brother Jamie tried to help, of course, but there was only so much he could do. I purposely chose friends who had fathers living at home." He laughed. "I remember one dark black kid named Willie Adams. His dad was at home all right, but he was an embarrassment to the family. He was an older man, nearing 60 at the time, and he didn't work. He just sat on the front porch in his rocking chair all day and drank beer. Whenever I went over to Willie's house to play, I would always find some excuse to spend a little time on the porch, sitting next to Mr. Adams. Willie would fidget uncomfortably, unable to understand why I wanted to listen to his father. "You don't know shit!" Carol put her head in her hands and began to cry. In that instant, a long-buried memory burst upon her mind. Her 5-year-old brother was sobbing hysterically and attacking her, pummeling her with his fists. She had her hands up to protect herself. "It's your fault, Carol," he was screaming. "He left because of you." She remembered the hot tears in her eyes. "It's not true, Richie. It's not true. It wasn't my fault." On the boat, Carol glanced up through her tears at Nick. He had backed away and was looking sheepish. She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "It was not my fault," Carol said deliberately and emphatically. Nick stuck out his hand to help her up, and she smacked it away. He mumbled, "I'm sorry," as she rose to her feet. "Now, if you will just shut up and listen," she continued, "I'll tell you what happened. The reef under the boat wasn't a reef at all. Oh, my God, it's here." Nick saw a look of consternation break on Carol's face. She pointed over behind him on the other side of the boat. He turned around to look. At first, he didn't notice anything. Then he saw a strange flat object that looked like a piece of carpet inching along the boat toward the telescope monitor. He screwed up his face and turned back to Carol with a puzzled expression. While Carol had been talking, the carpet had somehow crawled up the side and then flopped into the boat. By the time she started to explain, it was already standing in front of the television monitor, looking at the images the telescope was taking of the ocean floor beneath the boat. There was no time for lengthy explanations. "What the fuck?" Nick said, and walked over to apprehend the peculiar visitor. When his hand was about an inch away from touching the carpet, he felt a strong electrical discharge in the end of his fingers. "Ow!" he said, jumping back. He shook his hand and watched with amazement.
the carpet continued to stand in front of the screen. Nick looked at Carol as if he expected some assistance, but she was finding the whole scene amusing. "That thing is just one of the reasons the dive was strange," she said, making no effort to provide any help. "But I don't think it will hurt you. It probably saved my life." Nick grabbed a small fish net hanging on the side of the structure holding up the canopy and slowly approached the carpet. As he drew near, it seemed to turn and look at him. Nick lunged forward with the net. The carpet dodged deftly, and Nick lost his balance. He fell against the monitor with his arms akimbo. Carol laughed out loud, remembering the first time they met. The carpet flipped over to the telescope data system and wrapped itself tightly around the entire set of electronic equipment. From the floor of the boat, Nick watched the carpet investigating the data system and shook his head in disbelief. "What the hell is that thing, anyway?" he shouted to Carol. She came over and graciously offered a hand to help him up. It was her way of apologizing for her earlier outburst. "I have no earthly idea," Carol replied. "At first I thought it might be a sophisticated Navy robot, but it is much too advanced, too intelligent." She pointed at the sky with her free left hand. "They know," she said with a smile. The comment reminded Carol of Troy, and she became solemn. She walked over to the side of the boat and stared at the ocean. Nick was now standing up next to the monitor within an arm's length of the carpet and the data system. It looked as if the carpet had somehow extended part of itself into the internal electronics. Nick watched for a few seconds, fascinated, as the various digital diagnostic readouts on the top of the data system went crazy. "Hey, Carol," he said, "come here and look at this. That damn thing is plastic or something." She did not turn around at first. "Nick," Carol asked softly, finally facing him, "what are we going to do about Troy?" "As soon as we get this damn invader out of here," Nick replied from underneath the canopy, where he was now looking through his kitchen implements. "We'll do a systematic search of the area. I may even dive and see if I can find him." Nick had picked up a large cooking fork with a plastic handle and was about to attempt to pry the carpet off the data system. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," admonished Carol. "He'll leave when he's ready." But it was too late.
Side 8. Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 202. Nick stuck the fork into and through the carpet and up against the uppermost rack of electronic parts. There was a popping sound, and a tiny blue arc zapped down the fork, driving Nick backward with a powerful kick. Alarms went off. The digital readout from the data system went blank, and the ocean telescope monitor began to smoke. The carpet dropped down on the floor and began making the little waves that it had showed to Carol in the large room with a window on the ocean. A moment later, 2 alarms from the navigation system sounded, indicating not only that the boat's current location had been lost, but also that the non-volatile memory, where all the parameters that permitted satellite communication were stored, had been erased. In the middle of the noise and smoke, Nick stood with a puzzled expression on his face. He was rubbing his right arm from his wrist to his shoulder. "I'm numb," he said in astonishment. "I can't feel anything in my arm." The carpet continued with its wave patterns on the floor of the boat, while Carol picked up a pail, leaned overboard for some water, and doused the monitor. Nick had not moved. He was still standing there, looking helpless and pinching his arm. Carol threw the rest of the water on Nick. "Shit," he sputtered, backing up involuntarily. "Why did you do that?" "Because we have to find Troy," she said, walking over to the boat's controls. "And we can't wait all day. Ignore the damn carpet and your arm. A man's life is at stake." She increased the speed of the boat. As she did, the carpet stood up again, twisted around, and hustled to the side. Nick tried to stop it, but it was out of the boat and into the water in a flash. As Carol steered the boat through circles of larger and larger radius, Nick stood on the side of the Florida Queen and searched for Troy. An hour later, they both agreed there was no reason for them to continue the search. Carol and Nick had been over the entire region of the ocean in the boat several times, with some care and difficulty, because they no longer had a working navigation system, and had found no trace of Troy.
After he had convinced himself that his arm was all right, Nick had even donned his diving equipment as a last resort and had retraced the path from the fissure to the overhang and back. Still no sign of Troy. Nick had been just slightly tempted to investigate the fissure, but Carol's wild story seemed remotely plausible, and Nick did not like the idea of being sucked into some bizarre underground laboratory. And he knew that if he were to disappear, it would be virtually impossible for Carol to guide the boat back to Key West without an active navigation system. Carol recounted the whole story of her dive while she and Nick were canvassing the area. He was certain she was liberally embellishing the details, but he could see no overarching logical flaws in her tale. And he himself had, after all, confronted the carpet on the Florida Queen. So he acknowledged in his own mind that Carol and Troy had indeed had hair-raising experiences in an underwater building of some type, and that the technology they had encountered was definitely more advanced than anything they had ever seen before. But Nick was reluctant to accept Carol's blithe explanation that the trio had met some extraterrestrials. It didn't seem likely to Nick that a first contact would be made under such mundane circumstances. Although he readily admitted that the carpet was a marvel of capability far beyond his ken, he did not think of himself as being technologically sophisticated, and therefore he could not state categorically that human beings could not have created it. In fact, Nick thought to himself as he was carefully searching the horizon with his binoculars for reference landmarks before beginning the trip back to Key West, what a perfect deception. Suppose the Russians, or even our own Navy, wanted to mislead, except for the weapons stuff is relatively innocuous. She temporarily set aside the notion that her friend Troy had become some kind of pawn for the aliens. Carol could tell that Nick was growing more suspicious. Nick thought it was very peculiar that there were 3 Navy divers in the water at the exactly correct location when one of the carpets ushered Troy to the surface. And Troy's report of the interrogation process after they had flown him to Key West was so confused that Nick became exasperated again. "Christ, Jefferson," he said, "you either have a very short or a very convenient memory. You tell us that the Navy kept you in custody for almost an hour, yet you hardly remember any of their questions and have no idea why they were interrogating you. That just doesn't sound right to me." Troy was becoming a little angry. "Shit, Nick, I told you that I was tired. I had been through a traumatic experience. The questions didn't make sense to me. And the entire time, I felt as if a little voice was trying to make itself heard inside my head." Nick turned to Carol. "I think I'm changing my mind. I don't want to play in this game, no matter how clever it is. Homer and Greta annoy me, but I can deal with them if it's necessary. On the other hand, the Navy scares me. There was some reason they were following us. It's just too damn unlikely to be a coincidence. Maybe Troy knows something about it, and maybe he doesn't. I can't tell. But I don't like the smell of it." He stood up to leave. Carol motioned for Nick to sit down and took a deep breath. "Look, you two," she said in a low voice. "I have a confession to make, and it seems as if this is the perfect time to make it. I did not come down here to Key West to look for whales." She glanced at Nick. "And not for treasure either. I came here to check out a rumor that a new Navy missile had gone astray and crashed in the Gulf of Mexico." She paused several seconds to let her message register. "I probably should have told you earlier, but I never found the right time. I'm truly sorry." "And you thought the missile was in the fissure," said Troy a few seconds later, "which was why you came back yesterday." "We were going to salvage it for you and give you a worldwide scoop," added Nick, his feeling of betrayal softened somewhat by the obvious sincerity of her apology. "You were using us all the time." "You could call it that," Carol conceded. "But as a reporter, I don't see it that way." She noticed the tension in the room. Nick seemed especially guarded. "But now it doesn't matter anyway," she continued. "What is important is that I have given an explanation for the Navy's presence at the dive site. During the last 2 days, I have made several inquiries at all levels about the clandestine activities that the Navy currently has underway to search for the missile. Last night that Mexican lieutenant got a good look at our best close-ups of the missile in the fissure. Undoubtedly, someone put 2 and 2 together.
Look, Angel, Troy spoke after another short silence. I don't know anything about a missile, and too much is going on for me to be hurt because you lied to me. I'm sure you had your reasons. What I need to know now is whether or not you will help me take this stuff back to the ETs or aliens or whatever you want to call them.
Before Carol could answer, Nick stood up again and started walking toward the door. I'm very hungry, he announced, and I want to think through this entire situation. If you don't mind, Troy, I'll have an early supper and meet you later on tonight with my answer. Carol realized that she also was extremely hungry. It had been a long, exhausting day, and she had not eaten anything significant since breakfast. She was also a little concerned about Nick's response to her confession. Why don't I join you for a bite? She said to Nick. He gave a non-committal shrug as if to say, suit yourself. Carol gave Troy a hug. Let's all meet at my room in the Marriott around 7:30. I have to go there anyway to dress for my interview with the Triple Creeps. You guys can give me some pointers. Her humor did not lighten the atmosphere in the room. Troy was clearly worried about something. His face was very earnest, almost stern. Professor, he said to Nick in a soft and deliberate monotone, I know I didn't have all the answers to your questions. I don't even have the answers to my own. But I do know one thing for certain. Nothing like this has ever happened on the Earth before, at least not in recorded history. The creatures who built that spaceship are, when compared to us, as we would appear to the ants or the bees if they could comprehend us. They have asked the 3 of us for help in repairing their vehicle. To say that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity would be a colossal understatement. It would be great if we could sit around and debate this issue for weeks or even months, but we can't. Time is running out. The Navy is certain to find them soon. Maybe they have already, with possibly dire circumstances for the human beings on this planet. They have made it clear to me that their mission must be fulfilled, that they must repair their vehicle and continue their voyage, even if they must interfere with the Earth system to achieve their goal. I know all this sounds incredible, maybe even absurd, but I am going to collect some lead weights from my diver friends and pick up the compact discs at the library. With or without your help, I want to be over their spaceship at dawn tomorrow. Nick studied Troy very carefully during this speech. For an instant in the middle, it seemed as if it were not Troy speaking at all, but someone or something else speaking through him. An eerie chill raced down Nick's spine. Shit, he thought. I'm as bad as they are. I'm now caught up in this thing, too. He gestured to Carol to follow him and walked out the door. 7. As I have told you twice before, the voice sounded tired and bored, I was out diving with my friends, Nick Williams and Carol Dawson. She had a problem with her equipment and decided to make a quick return to the boat. We had found a particularly interesting reef with some very unusual features, and we weren't certain we would be able to locate it again. So I decided to stay and wait for her to come back. When I finally surfaced half an hour later, there was no sign of them or the boat. The recorder clicked off. The 2 lieutenants stared at each other. Shit, Ramirez, do you believe that bastard's story? Any part of it? The other man shook his head. Then why the hell did you let him go? That black shit-ass sat there for an hour making fools out of us with ridiculous answers to our questions, and then you summarily released him. We can't detain someone without positive evidence of wrongdoing, responded Ramirez, as if he were quoting from a military manual. And swimming in the ocean 10 miles from the nearest island, although strange, does not constitute wrongdoing. Ramirez could see that his colleague was scowling. Besides, he never slipped up. He always told exactly the same story. The same bullshit, you mean? Lieutenant Richard Todd leaned back in his chair. The 2 men were sitting around a small conference table in an old room with white plaster walls.
The tape recorder was on the table in front of them next to an empty ashtray. He didn't even believe his own story. He just sat there, that cocky grin on his black face, knowing that we couldn't charge him with anything. Todd put all 4 of his chair legs back on the floor and pounded the table for emphasis. An experienced diver would never stay down by himself for 5 minutes, much less 30. Too many things could go wrong. As for his friends, why the hell did they leave him? Now Todd stood up and made gestures in the air with his hands. I'll tell you why, Lieutenant. Because they knew he was all right, that he had been picked up by a Russian submarine. Shit, I told you we should have taken one of the new vessels. We probably could have spotted the sub with the upgraded electronic gear. Ramirez was playing idly with the glass ashtray while Todd was giving his lecture. You really believe that those 3 are involved with the Russians in this, don't you? It sure seems far-fetched to me. Fucking A, replied Todd. Nothing else makes even a little sense. Every engineer we have talked to says there are no conceivable failures that are consistent both with the observed behavior of the missile and the telemetry we received at our tracking stations. So the Russians must have commanded it off course. Todd grew excited as he explained the rest of the plot. The Russians knew they would need some local help to find the exact location of the missile in the ocean, so they hired Williams and crew to search for the bird and then tell them where it was. They planned to pick it up with one of their subs. Adding that Dawson woman to their team was a masterstroke. Her inquiries have slowed down our own search by making us more concerned about the press. Lieutenant Ramirez laughed. You always sound convincing, Richard. But we still do not have even one shred of evidence. I don't believe Troy Jefferson's story any more than you do, but there could be many reasons why he lied, only one of which is any of our business. Besides, there still is a fundamental problem with your explanation. Why would the Russians go to all this trouble just to seize a Panther missile? You and I and even Commander Winters may not know the true story of the Panther missile, Todd countered quickly. It may be designed to carry some new breakthrough weapon that we haven't even heard about. It's not all that unusual for the Navy to represent a project falsely and to keep its true purpose hidden. He stopped to think. But what's motivating the Russians is not that important to us. We have evidence of a conspiracy here. Our job is to stop it. Ramirez did not reply right away. He continued to push the ashtray around on the table. I guess I no longer view it that way, he said at length, gazing directly at Todd. I see no substantial evidence of any conspiracy. Unless Commander Winters himself orders additional work from my department, I am abandoning my investigation. He looked at his watch. At least I can still spend Saturday night and Sunday with my family. He rose to leave. And what if I bring you proof? Todd asked, making no effort to hide his disgust with Ramirez. Proof will convince Winters as well, Ramirez answered coldly. I have taken enough risk on this project. I will not take any more action unless instructed by the proper authority. Winters wasn't really certain he would find something appropriate. Ordinarily, he carefully avoided shopping malls, especially on a Saturday afternoon. But while he had been lying on the couch, watching one of the NCAA basketball games and sipping a beer, he had remembered how pleased he had been when Helen Turnbull, who had played Maggie, had given him a set of unusual tile coasters after the opening weekend of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. It's a fading tradition in the theater, I fear, the experienced actress had said when he thanked her. But giving small presents after the opening night or nights is still my way of congratulating those people I have enjoyed working with. The mall was crowded with Saturday shoppers, and Commander Winters felt oddly conspicuous, as if everyone were looking at him. He walked around for several minutes before he even thought about what kind of gift he might get for her. Something simple, of course, he thought. Nothing that could be misinterpreted. Just a nice memento or a souvenir. He saw Tiffany in his mind's eye as she had appeared in his fantasy just before he had fallen asleep the night before. The image embarrassed him in the shopping crowd, and he nervously called up another picture, this one wholesome and acceptable, of the little girl Tiffany during his conversation with her father. Her hair,
he thought, remembering the pigtails. I'll buy her something for her hair. He walked into a gift shop and tried to make some sense out of the jumble of bric-a-brac that lined the walls and was assembled on top of an assortment of tables in no identifiable pattern. "Can I help you?" Winters jumped when a salesgirl approached him from behind. He shook his head. "Now, why did you do that?" he said to himself. "Of course you need help. Otherwise, you'll never find anything." "Excuse me, young lady," he almost shouted at the retreating salesgirl. "I guess I could use some advice. I want to buy a present." Winters again felt as if everyone were watching him. "For my niece," he added quickly. The salesgirl was a brunette, about 20, very plain, but with an eager face. "Did you have anything in mind?" she asked. Her hair was long, like Tiffany's. Winters relaxed a little. "Sort of," he said. "She has beautiful long hair, like yours. What could I get her that would be really special? It's her birthday." Again he felt a strange anxiety that he did not understand. "What color?" the girl asked. The question didn't make sense. "I don't even know yet what I want," he replied with a puzzled expression. "So I certainly don't know the color." The salesgirl smiled. "What color is your niece's hair?" she said very slowly, almost as if she were speaking to a mental retard. "Oh, of course," Winters laughed. "Reddish-brown, auburn," he said. "And it's very long." "You said that already," a voice whispered inside of him. "You were acting like a fool." The salesgirl motioned for him to follow her, and they walked back to the rear of the store. She pointed at a small round glass case full of combs of all shapes and sizes. "These would make excellent gifts for your niece," she said. There was an inflection in her voice when she said the word niece that bothered Winters. Could she know something? One of her friends? Or maybe she was at the play. He took a breath and calmed himself. Again, Winters was astounded by the volatility of his emotions. On one of the small shelves were two beautiful matching brown combs with gold filigree across the top. One of the combs was large enough to hold all that magnificent hair in a chignon against her neck. The other smaller comb was a perfect size to adorn the side or back of her hairstyle. "I'll take those," he said to the girl, "the ones with the gold work along the top. And please gift-wrap them for me." The efficient salesgirl reached inside the display case and pulled out the combs. She told Winters to wait a couple of minutes while she wrapped the present. She disappeared into the back of the store, and Winters was left alone. "I'll leave them on her dressing table at the end of intermission," he was thinking. He conjured up a picture of Tiffany going into the dressing room by herself and finding the present under her nameplate against the mirror. Winters smiled as he imagined her reaction. At that moment, a woman with her 8 or 9-year-old daughter brushed by him in the store. "Pardon me," the woman said without looking around, as she and the little girl rushed to finger some Easter baskets hanging on the wall. The salesgirl had finished wrapping the present and was standing next to the computer cash register. When Winters reached the counter, she handed him a small card that had "Happy Birthday" imprinted on the upper left corner. Winters stared at it for a few seconds. "No," he said finally. "No card. I'll buy another at the stationery store." "Cash or charge?" the girl asked him. Winters panicked for a moment. "I don't know if I have enough cash on me," he thought. "And how would I ever explain the charge to Betty?" He opened his wallet and counted his money. He smiled at the girl and said, "Cash, please," when he realized that he had almost $50. The bill was only $32, including the tax. Commander Winters felt a rush of joy as he nearly skipped out of the organ, accompanied the picture. "That's the music room I told you about," Carol said to Nick. "I guess that warden thing had a video camera and all his paraphernalia." The television scene switched immediately to a close-up of Carol's eyes. For 5 seconds, her marvelous, frightened eyes filled almost the entire screen. She blinked twice before the camera pulled back and revealed her in front view, terrified, standing and shaking in her bathing suit. Carol shuddered as she recalled the horror of those seconds when the warden's appendages intruded upon her person. It was all shown in the video, some parts even in slow motion. One of the featured scenes was the deliberate movement of the bristles across her chest, including both her erect nipples. Oh, my God, she thought. I hadn't realized they were erect. Maybe fear does that. Carol squirmed. She felt surprisingly embarrassed in front of Nick. There was a jump discontinuity in the program. In the next scene, the three of them were looking at Troy, lying on his back on the floor somewhere, with enough wires and cords attached to him that he could have been Gulliver bound by the Lilliputians. The camera panned around the room. Two wardens were in one of the corners. Their upper body attachments were not even similar, but they both had the same central body, amoeba-like, that had confronted Troy and Carol. On the other side of the room, a pair of carpets were standing together. From their motions, it looked as if they were engaged in a conversation. Nick and Carol and Troy watched while the camera stayed fixed for about 10 seconds. The carpets apparently finished conferring and then flipped off in separate directions. The final frames of the transmission were a close-up of Troy's head showing more than 100 probes and inserts connected to his brain. Then the screen went back to snow and static. "Wowee," said Nick after a moment. "Can I have an instant replay?" He stood up from the bed. "You were terrific," he remarked to Carol. "But I think your scenes will have to be edited if we want a PG rating." Carol looked up at him and blushed slightly. "Sorry, Nick, but I don't think you make a good comedian. We have one already." She nodded at Troy. "And I think that's enough." She glanced at the clock beside her bed. "Now I figure we have 15 minutes or so to make plans, no more, and I have to dress as well. Why don't you tell Troy about your decision and what you have concluded about the Santa Rosa loot while I change my clothes?" She grabbed a blouse and a pair of pants and headed for the bathroom. "Hey, wait a minute," Nick protested. "Aren't we going to discuss who it was that broke into my condominium and your hotel room?" Carol stopped outside the bathroom door. "There are only two possibilities that make any sense," she said. "It's either the Navy or our sicko friends from the Ambrosia. Either way, we'll find out soon enough." She stopped a moment, and an elfin smile played across her lips. "I want you two to see if you can figure out a way to steal Homer's gold tonight, before we go back to meet with our extraterrestrials tomorrow morning." Side 9. Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 229. 9. Carol and Troy went over the details one last time, and she checked her watch. "It's 8:30 already," she said. "If I'm much later, I know they'll be suspicious." She was standing outside Nick's Pontiac in the parking lot of the Pelican Resort, a restaurant about 3/4 of a mile from the Ashford mansion at Pelican Point. "Where is he?" she fretted. "We should have finished with this 15 minutes ago." "Just calm down, Angel," Troy replied. "We have to test this new unit first. It could be very important in an emergency, and I've never actually used it." He gave her a reassuring hug. "Your friends at MOI originally developed it." "Why did I have to suggest such a wild-ass idea?" Carol said out loud to herself. "Where's your brain, Dawson? Did you leave it in the—" "Can you hear me?" Nick's garbled voice interrupted her. It sounded as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. "Yes," Troy answered into a tiny walkie-talkie shaped like a thimble. "But not too clearly. How deep are you?" "Say again," said Nick. "I did not copy completely." "Yes, we can hear you," Troy shouted. He carefully enunciated each word. "But not very clearly. You must speak slowly and distinctly. How deep are you?" "About 8 feet," was the response. "Go down to 16 and try it again," said Troy. "Let's see if it will work from the deepest part of the cave." "How's he doing that?" Carol asked, while they waited for Nick to descend. "It's a brand-new system built into the regulator," Troy answered. "You have to speak while you're exhaling for it to work. There's a small transmitter-receiver inside the mouthpiece and an earphone attachment. Unfortunately, it doesn't work much below 10 feet. Almost a minute later, Carol and Troy heard something very faint, not even recognizable as Nick's voice. Troy listened for a moment. "We cannot read you, Nick. There is too much attenuation. Come on back now. I'm going to send Carol on her way." Troy pressed a button on the walkie-talkie that would repeatedly transmit this last message. He handed the communications unit to Carol. "Okay, Angel," he said. "You're ready. We should be in the water around 9 o'clock and out, if all goes well, by half an hour later. Keep them occupied with your questions. You should leave by 10:30 at the latest and drive directly to Nick's apartment. We will meet you there with your wagon." He raised his eyebrows. "And the gold, I hope." Carol took a deep breath. She smiled at Troy. "I'm scared," she said. "I would rather face a carpet or even one of those warden things than this trio." She opened the car door. "Do you really think I should go in Nick's car? Isn't that certain to make them suspect something?" "We've been through all this twice before, Angel," Troy laughingly replied. He gently nudged her into the car. "They already know we're friends. Besides, we need your wagon for the diving gear, the backpacks, and the lead and gold." He closed the door and planted a light kiss on her cheek through the open window. "Be safe, Angel," he said, "and don't take any unnecessary chances." Carol started the car and backed into the middle of the parking lot. She waved at Troy and pulled into the dark lane that led through the marsh to the end of the island. The only light was from the nearly full gibbous moon that was already above the trees. "All right, Dawson," she thought to herself. "Now you're in the middle of it. Just stay calm and alert." She drove very slowly. She reviewed the plans for the evening several times in her mind. Then she started thinking about Nick. He holds on to things, like I do. He still hates Homer and Greta for cheating him. He couldn't wait to die for the gold. She smiled as she turned into the circular drive in front of Homer Ashford's house. I just hope there is some left over for him. A split second after Carol rang the doorbell, Homer opened the door and greeted her. "You're late," he said in a pleasant monotone. "We thought maybe you were not coming. Greta is already in the pool. Do you want to change and join her?" "Thanks, Captain Homer, but I decided not to swim tonight," Carol answered politely. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm mostly here on business. I would prefer to start the interview as soon as possible, even before dinner, if that would be all right with everyone else." Homer led Carol into a gigantic family room and stopped by a large wet bar. A magnificent hand-carved wooden statue of a swimming Neptune, about 4 feet long altogether, was on the wall above the bar. Carol asked for some white wine. Homer tried without success to talk her into something stronger. The family room had a billiards table at one end. On the other side, a sliding glass door opened onto a covered patio that narrowed into a cement walkway. Carol followed Homer in silence, sipping from her white wine every 20 steps or so. "Good old-fashioned miracle. Like the Blue Fairy." "What are you shits whispering about over there?" The truculent Lieutenant Todd began to walk toward the bathroom at the west end of the long room. "Knock it off, and don't try anything. The outside door is locked, and I have the key." He didn't close the bathroom door. The urinal was fortunately out of view to the right. There was not much light in the back of the small bathroom. As Todd was finishing his piss, he became aware of a strange sensation all over his right side, as if 1,000 very small needles were sticking in him. Puzzled, he turned toward the corner. What he saw there sent an incredible shock of terror racing through his system. In the corner, partially hidden in the poor light, was what could only be described as a 6-foot carrot. The thicker end of the creature was balanced on 4 webbed pads planted on the floor. There were no arms, but about 5 feet above the ground, just under a maze of blue spaghetti of unknown purpose on top of its head, 4 vertical slits, each a foot long, were cut in what might have been its face. Out of each of these slits, something strange was hanging. Troy would later explain to Nick and Carol that these were sensors, that the carrot saw, heard, smelled, and tasted with these dangling extensions. Lieutenant Todd did not wait to study the creature. He let out a whoop and backed quickly out of the bathroom. He did not stop to retract his penis or zip his fly. When the weird orange thing next appeared in the light at the door to the bathroom, the lieutenant was certain it was going to follow him. He stared at it, petrified and immobile, for half a second. Then, when it did indeed move toward him, Todd immediately turned around, unlocked the front door, and burst through it. Unfortunately, he forgot about the 8 concrete steps. In his panic, he tripped and fell. He smacked his head hard on the second step and tumbled down to the bottom. He lay unconscious on his back on the sidewalk in front of the building. Carol had cowered against Nick when she had first seen the carrot. Then they had both glanced at Troy. He was smiling and humming to himself. "When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are." He seemed so blasé about everything that Nick and Carol even relaxed temporarily. However, after Lieutenant Todd disappeared out the front door and the carrot turned to face them, it was difficult to remain calm. "Nuts," said Troy with a big smile. "I was really hoping for the blue fairy. I thought she might make me rich, or maybe even white." "All right, Jefferson," Nick said. His face looked as if he had just eaten a lemon. "Please explain what that thing in front of us is." Troy first walked slowly over to the corner of the room to pick up their backpacks. "This, Professor," he replied, as he then walked directly up to the carrot, "is what we might call a holographic projection." He put his hand into and through the orange body. "Somewhere in the universe there is supposedly a real-life creature like this, but they have only sent his image to help us escape." Even with Troy's explanation, Nick and Carol did not want to come any closer to the stationary carrot than was absolutely necessary. They moved with their backs against the walls until they reached the door. "Don't worry," Troy laughed. "It won't hurt you." The sensor hanging out of the slit on the far right of the carrot's head was totally incomprehensible. Carol could not take her eye off of it. It looked like a wad of gooey honeycomb stuck on the end of a majorette's baton. "What does it do with that?" Carol asked, pointing as she preceded Troy out the door. "I don't know, Angel," Troy answered, "but it must be fun." Nick and Troy joined Carol on the platform at the top of the stairs. They all saw Todd at about the same time. They were naturally surprised to find him lying at the bottom of the steps. His head was bleeding. "Should we help him?" Carol wondered out loud as Troy bounded down the stairs in front of her. "No way," Nick replied quickly. Troy bent down beside Todd and carefully examined the unconscious lieutenant from head to toe. He slapped the big man lightly on the cheek. Lieutenant Todd did not move. Troy winked at his friends at the top of the stairs. "The professor was right, my man," he said, breaking into a grin. "You really aren't shit." "So I kissed her," Carol said with a laugh. "You did what?" asked Nick. They were in Troy's old Ford LTD driving toward the Hemingway Marina. After leaving the base, they had walked the 1.5 miles to Troy's duplex to pick up his car. Carol was beside Troy in the front seat, and Nick was in the back next to the backpacks containing the gold and the information discs. Carol turned around to Nick. "I kissed her." She laughed again as Nick screwed up his face in disgust. "What was I supposed to do? The woman is stronger than most men. She had me pinned on the floor. There was something just a little suggestive about the way she was holding me." "Woo-wee, Angel." Troy slapped the dashboard with his left hand. "You are amazing. What did Superkraut do next?" "She released her grip on my wrists, just for a second. I think she was deciding whether to kiss me back." "Yuck," said Nick from the back seat. "I think I'm going to be sick." "So you smashed her upside of the head and then ran off?" asked Troy. Carol nodded. Troy laughed heartily, and then became more serious. "Be careful if you ever see her again, Angel. Greta does not like to lose." "But you're wrong about her in one respect, Carol," Nick remarked. "Greta's not into women at all. She likes sex with men too much." Carol found Nick's comment smug and even irritating. She spoke across the front seat to Troy. "Why is it, Troy, that men naturally assume that any woman who has sexual relations with men could not possibly be interested in having sex with another woman? Is this another example of their fundamental belief in their own innate superiority?" She didn't wait for an answer. Carol turned around again to talk to Nick. "And in case you're wondering, the answer is no, I'm not a lesbian. I am relentlessly heterosexual, as much because of my San Fernando Valley middle-class background as anything. But I will admit that sometimes I grow extremely tired of men and what I call their baboon demonstrations of macho. "Hey," Nick replied. "I didn't mean to start an argument. I was just suggesting—" Okay, Carol interrupted, loosening up a bit. "No harm done. I guess I am a little quick on the trigger." She was quiet for a few seconds. "By the way, Nick," she remarked then, "there's one part of this that I still don't understand completely. Why did Captain Homer go to such great lengths to hide the rest of the treasure all this time? Why didn't he just sell it off as soon as he could?" "Lots of reasons," Nick replied, "not the least of which was fear that he might somehow be discovered and indicted for the perjury he committed during our trial. But this way he also escapes the IRS. The value of the gold appreciates in time, and, most importantly, Greta has to hang around if she wants her whole share. He almost certainly converts some of it to cash from time to time, probably through a third party, but never enough to call attention to the transaction." "So you see, Angel," Troy said, "that's why there's no way he can call the police, because he would have to admit everything. I bet he's really pissed off." Troy pulled into a left-hand turn lane and waited for the signal to change. A car pulled up beside them on the right next to Carol, and she just happened to look idly in that direction. It was a Mercedes. Later on, Carol would recall that time seemed to dilate for her. Each second of the next minute was recorded in her memory in super slow motion, as if it were covering a much longer period of time. Greta was driving Captain Homer's car and was staring at Carol. Homer was sitting beside her, waving his fists, poised to confirm the original design specifications for the planet. But the instruments do not, as planned, validate the set of design assumptions. The environment has changed. Not markedly, not as if it had been reworked on a massive scale by an advanced intelligence for some specific purpose. The initial data strongly suggests, instead, that during the last cycle or two, some indigenous intelligence has emerged that has had a non-trivial impact on both the planet's surface and its atmosphere. As the remote sensing instruments continue their survey of the target planet, something even more unusual is discovered. There are artificial satellites, thousands of them, in orbit around the body. A spacefaring species now makes this planet its home. An alarm is triggered in the central computer of the spaceship. The zygotes and the cradle system destined for this planet were not designed to deal with any other advanced species. However, the brilliant engineers of the colony had anticipated that at least one of the dozen target planets might have changed significantly during the 3 cycles since the last regular observations. A contingency protocol for handling new situations has been programmed into the approach sequence. Essentially, this protocol calls for careful analysis of the new conditions on the planet, assessment of the impact of those conditions on the key probability of survival parameters, and then, assuming that the impact assessment is not unsatisfactory, transfer, where possible, of new information into the electronic infrastructure responsible for the education of the repatriated species after cradle deployment. Side 10. Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 258. One of the special subroutines in the contingency protocol handles the surprise emergence of a new spacefaring species. The first action in the sequence is the examination of one of the orbiting satellites to assess its technological sophistication. With great care, the interstellar spaceship eases into a rendezvous position with one of the artificial satellites that remain mostly stationary above a single region on the rotating planet below. Using superfast burst algorithms stored in the communications macro, the spacecraft searches for and establishes the command and telemetry frequencies of its neighbor, but attempts to actually command the satellite fail, suggesting an elaborate protective code embedded in the receivers and/or a complicated redundant command procedure.
Without being able to command a satellite and thus assess its capabilities, the visiting spaceship cannot conclusively establish the technological stage of the new spacefaring species. The contingency protocol calls in this situation for trying to capture the satellite to perform in situ analysis, provided there is no obvious danger from devices on board the satellite itself. This particular branch in the software logic for the spaceship was the subject of intense debate by the oversight board of the Committee of Engineers back during the design process several cycles earlier. Many of the more experienced engineers thought that it was risky to include such a logic loop, primarily because of the possibility that a paranoid emerging culture might arm their satellites with destructive devices that could not be easily recognized and disarmed. However, it was argued on the basis of historical evidence from throughout the galaxy that since most incipient civilizations abolish warfare and aggression before they become spacefaring, absence of a clearly identifiable destruct or protective device was sufficient additional evidence to allow the careful capturing and dismantling of a satellite. And everyone agreed that the detailed information about the technological status of the new species that would result from such reverse engineering would be extremely valuable in completing the assessment of the risk to the repatriated species. Great remote manipulator arms extend from the spacecraft, seize the surveillance satellite, and pull it into a large room with vaulted ceilings. An army of small electronic robots attacks it at once, scurrying all over its surface with probes and attachments. Trillions of bits of data about the satellite are fed into the primary data storage device in the spaceship computer. The new spacefarers are not very advanced technically. In fact, the computer algorithm concludes it is very surprising that they have even mastered launching and maintaining so many satellites. An explosion starts to rip through the room. An astonishing sequence of events takes place almost instantaneously after the explosion, as the spaceship deploys its protective resources to stop the spread of the fireball and mitigate the damage caused by the small nuclear device that has vaporized its host satellite. The explosion is quickly contained by unknown techniques, but not until considerable destruction has been caused on board the interstellar craft. An elaborate self-test occupies the great spaceship after the explosion. Detailed computer analysis of the damage indicates that the probability of successfully deploying the cradles at the additional 8 planets would be measurably increased if the mission were temporarily interrupted to allow some repair processes to take place. A safe haven to conduct the repair operations in a known environment with very few variations is the concomitant requirement. The master computer decides, based on the system and subsystem constraints that must be applied during the repairs, that the shallow ocean floor on this target planet is a perfect place for such a hiatus in the mission plan. The spaceship descends into the atmosphere, again reconfiguring itself to expose a set of aerodynamic control surfaces. During its rapid descent, the flight path is crossed by a bullet-shaped vehicle that has just been released from a high-altitude airplane. The spaceship approaches and then flies alongside the missile. The missile telemetry is intercepted by the spaceship and correlated with the types of downlink data extracted from the satellite earlier. The spaceship computer uses its enormous processing capability and cross-correlation algorithms to try to break the command code of the tiny missile. Eventually, it is successful, and the visitor is able to interact with the guided projectile. The spaceship commands the missile to read out its guidance subroutines. Performing quadrillions of computations per second, the intelligent computer at the heart of the interstellar craft deduces the targeting strategy for the missile. A target image that would result in the missile landing in the ocean close to the chosen location for the space vehicle is commanded into the missile's guidance algorithm. The spacecraft and missile plunge in tandem into the Gulf of Mexico. The two vehicles come to rest about 2 miles apart on the ocean floor. Within the carefully coded fault protection software of the great spaceship, which took over operation of the craft immediately after the explosion of the satellite, 4 separate activities are being conducted in parallel. One of the processors is sorting through the data archives associated with this particular planet to determine what possible indigenous species could have gone through an evolutionary burst and become spacefaring with such rapidity. Coupled with this first set of computations is an evaluation of the impact of such a local advanced intelligence on the survivability of the repatriated zygotes. Among the questions addressed by the evaluation is what active steps can be taken by the spaceship now to increase the likelihood of successful embryo germination and development. A third processor in the central computer performs a thorough, detailed analysis of the spacecraft state, including careful assessments of repair techniques and materials needed to fix each. There are superhumans inside that package we found. Not just better flowers and better bugs, but better people as well. But unlike Troy, Carol's immediate reaction was not fear. She was overwhelmed by curiosity. "Can I see them?" she asked excitedly. Troy didn't understand. "The superhumans, or whatever you want to call them," she continued. "Can I see them?" Troy shook his head. "They're just tiny zygotes, Angel. More than 1 billion would fit in your hand. You wouldn't be able to see anything." Carol was not dissuaded. "But these guys have such amazing technological ability. Maybe they can—" She stopped. "Wait a minute, Troy. Remember that carrot on the base? It was a holographic projection and must have come somehow out of the information base on this spacecraft." Carol walked away from Troy into the middle of the room. She raised her arms and looked up at the ceiling 30 feet above her. "Okay, you guys, whoever you are," she invoked in a loud voice. "Now there's something that I want. We risked our ass to get what you needed for your repairs. You can at least reciprocate. I want to see what we might look like someday." To their left, not too far from one of the large blocky machines connected to the cylinder, 2 of the wall partitions moved apart to form a hallway. They could see light at the other end. "Come on," an exultant Carol called to Troy, who was again smiling and admiring her assertiveness. "Let's go see what our super aliens have created for us now." At the end of the short corridor, there was a softly lit square room about 20 feet on a side. Against the opposite wall, illuminated by a blue light that gave the entire tableau a surrealistic appearance, 8 children were standing around a large glowing model of the Earth. As Carol and Troy approached, they recognized that what they were seeing was not real, that it was simply a complex sequence of images projected into the air in front of them. But the diaphanous picture contained such rich detail that it was easy to forget it was just a projection. The children were 4 or 5 years old. All were wearing only a thin white loincloth that covered their genitals. There were 4 girls and 4 boys. 2 of them were black, 2 were Caucasian with blue eyes and blonde hair, 2 were Oriental, and the final boy and girl, definitely twins, looked like a mixture of all humanity. What Carol immediately noticed was their eyes. All 8 children had large, piercing eyes of brilliant intensity that were focused on the glowing Earth in front of them. "The continents of this planet," the little black boy was saying, "were once tied together in a single gigantic land mass that stretched from pole to pole. This was relatively recently, only about 200 million years ago. Since that time, the motion of the plates on which the individual land masses rest has completely changed the configuration of the surface. Here, for example, you can see the Indian subcontinent tearing away from Antarctica 100 million years ago and moving across the ocean toward an eventual collision with Asia. It was this collision and the subsequent plate interaction that lifted the Himalayas, the highest mountains on the planet, to their current height." As the little boy was talking, the electronic model Earth in front of him demonstrated the continental changes that he was describing. "But what is the mechanism that causes these plates and land masses to move with respect to each other?" the tiny blonde-haired girl asked. "Psst," Carol whispered in Troy's ear. "How come they are speaking English and know all this Earth geography?" Troy looked at her as if he were disappointed and made a circular motion with his hands. "Of course," Carol said to herself. "They've already processed the disks." Then this activity results in material being thrust upward from the mantle below the Earth's crust. Eventually, the continents are pushed apart. Any other questions?
The black boy was smiling. He pointed at the model in front of him. Here's what will happen to the land masses in the next 50 million years or so. The Americas will continue to move to the west, away from Africa and Europe, making the South Atlantic a much larger ocean. The Persian Gulf will close altogether. Australia will drive north toward the equator and press against Asia, and both Baja California and the area around Los Angeles will split off from North America to drift northward in the Pacific Ocean. By 50 million years from now, Los Angeles will start sliding into the Aleutian Islands. All of the children watched the changing globe with complete attention. When the continents on the surface of the model stopped moving, the Oriental boy stepped slightly out from the group. We have seen this continental drift phenomenon that Brian has been describing on half a dozen other planets, all of them bodies mostly covered by a liquid. Tomorrow, Sherry will lead a more detailed discussion about the forces inside a planet that caused the seafloor to spread in the first place. A projected image of a warden entered the scene from the left and removed both the Earth globe and several other unidentified props. The small boy waited patiently for the warden to complete his task and then continued. Darla and David now want to share with us a project they have been working on for several days. They will play the music while Miranda and Justin perform the dance they choreographed. The mixed twins turned eagerly to their classmates. The girl spoke out. When we first learned about adult love and the changes that we all can expect after we pass puberty, David and I tried to envision what it would be like to find a new desire even stronger than those we already know. Our joint vision became a short musical composition and a dance. We call it the Dance of Love. The two children sat down away from the group, almost at the side of the image, and began moving their fingers rapidly as if they were typing on the floor. A light synthesized melody, pleasant and spirited, filled the room. The blond boy and the Oriental girl began to dance in the center of the group. At first in the dance, the two were totally separate, unaware of each other, each child completely absorbed in his own activities. The boy knelt down to pick a beautiful flower, its red and white coloring shimmering in the holographic projection. The girl bounced a large, bright blue ball as she danced. After a while, the little girl noticed the boy and approached him, somewhat tentatively, offering to share the ball. The boy played ball with her, but ignored everything except the game. This is magic, thought Carol as she watched the children's images moving with grace and deft precision in front of her. These children are wonderful, but they can't be real. They are too orderly, too self-contained. Where is the tension, the strife? But despite her questions, she was profoundly moved by the scene she was witnessing. The children were acting in concert as a group, flowing in harmony from activity to activity. Their body language was open and unafraid. No neuroses were blocking their learning process. The dance continued. The music deepened as the boy began to pay attention to his partner, and she began arranging her hair with his favorite flowers for their brief encounters. The body movements changed as well, the sprightly, exuberant bounces of the initial stages giving way to subtly suggestive motions designed to awaken and then tease the budding libido. The tiny dancers touched, moved away, and came back together in an embrace. Carol was entranced. How would my life have been different, she wondered, if I had known all this at the age of 5? She remembered her rich friend at soccer camp, Jessica from Laguna Beach, whom she had seen occasionally in subsequent years. Jessica was always ahead, always had to be first. She had had sex with boys before I even started my period, and look what happened to her. 3 marriages, 3 divorces, just 30 years old. Carol tried to stop her mind from drifting so that she could pay complete attention to the dance. Suddenly, she remembered her camera. She had just taken her first pictures of the children when she heard a noise behind her. Nick was coming toward them through the corridor, and he was carrying the trident in his hand. Nick started to say something, but Troy hushed him by putting his finger against his own lips and pointing at the dance in progress. The tempo had now changed. The two reached under his pillow and found the little New Testament that always stayed there day and night. He had opened it to Matthew 28. "Go ye, therefore," it had said, "baptizing all nations." That had been enough. Side 11, Cradle, by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee. Continuing on page 287. Then Vernon had prayed for sleep. His friendly, fatherly God had sent the little boy an image of himself, delivering a spellbinding performance in the pageant the next day. Comforted by that picture, he had fallen asleep. Praise him, all creatures here below. With the second phrase of the hymn resounding in his ears, the venue for Winter's mental montage changed to Annapolis, Maryland. He was a young man now, in the last 2 years of his university work at the Naval Academy. The pictures that flooded his brain were all taken at the same place, outside the beautiful little Protestant chapel in the middle of the campus. He was either walking in or walking out. He went in the snow, in the rain, and in the late summer heat. He would fulfill his pledge. He had made a bargain with God, a business deal, as it were. You do your part, and I'll do mine. It was no longer a one-sided relationship. Now life had taught the serious young midshipman from Indiana that it was necessary to offer this God something in order to guarantee his compliance with the deal. For 2 years, Vernon went regularly to the chapel, twice a week at least. He did not really worship there. He corresponded with a worldly God, one that read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They discussed things. Vernon reminded him that he was steadfastly upholding his end of the deal and thanked him for keeping his part of the bargain. But never once did they talk about Joanna Carr. She didn't matter. The whole affair was between Midshipman Vernon Winters and God. Praise him above ye heavenly host. The commander had unconsciously bowed his head almost to the floor by the time he heard the third phrase of the hymn. In his heart, he knew the next stops on this spiritual journey. He was off the coast of Libya first, praying those horrible words, requesting death and destruction for Gaddafi's family. God had changed as Lieutenant Winters had matured. He was now an executive, a president of something larger than a nation, an admiral, a judge, somewhat remote, but still accessible in time of real need. However, he had lost his all-forgiving nature. He had become stern and judgmental. Killing a small Arab girl wasn't like burning down the vacant lot across from the Smith mansion. Winter's God now held him personally accountable for all his actions. And there were some sins almost beyond forgiveness, some deeds so heinous that one might wait for weeks, months, or even years in the anterooms of his court before he would consent to hear your plea for mercy and expiation. Again the commander remembered his desperate search for him after that awful evening when he had sat on the couch beside his wife and watched the videotaped newsreels of the Libya bombing. She had been so proud of him. She had taped every segment of CBS News that had covered the North African engagement and then surprised him with a complete showing the day after he returned to Norfolk. It was only then that the full horror of what he had done had struck Winters. Struggling not to vomit as the camera had shown the gruesome result of those missiles that had been fired from his planes, Winters had stumbled out into the night air alone and wandered until daybreak. He had been looking for him. 12 times in the next 3 years this rite would repeat itself, and he would wander again all night, alternately praying and walking, hoping for some sign that he had listened to the commander's prayers. The stars and moon above him on those nights had been magnificent, but they could not grant forgiveness, could not give surcease to his troubled soul. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And so God became blackness, a void, for Commander Winters. On those rare occasions afterward when he would pray, there was no longer any mental image of God, no picture of him at all in his mind. There was just blackness, darkness, emptiness. Until this moment. As he knelt there outside the cylinder, heard the final phrase of the doxology, and prayed to God to forgive him his doubts, his longings for Tiffany Thomas, and his general lack of direction, there was an explosion of light in Winter's mind's eye. God was speaking to him. God had at last given him a sign. It was not the sign that Winters had been seeking, not evidence that he had finally forgiven the commander and accepted his penance, but something much, much better. The explosion of light in Winter's mind was a star, a solar furnace forging helium out of hydrogen. As his mental camera backed away rapidly, Winters could see planets around that star and signs of intelligence on a few of the planets. There were other stars and other planets in the distance, billions of stars in this galaxy alone, and, after the mammoth voids between the galaxies, more huge collections of stars and planets and living creatures stretching incomprehensible distances in all directions. Winter's body shook with joy and his eyes flooded with tears when he realized how completely God had answered his prayers. It would not have been enough for him to simply reveal to Winters that he was forgiven. No, this Lord of everything imaginable, whose domain embraced chemicals risen to consciousness on millions of worlds in a vast and uncountable universe, this God who was truly omnipotent and ubiquitous, had gone way beyond his prayers. He had shown Winters the unity in everything. He had not limited himself just to the affairs of one individual on a small and insignificant blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow sun in one of the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. He had also shown Winters how that species and its pool of intelligence and spirituality was connected to every part of every atom in his grand dominion. As Nick walked across the room toward Commander Winters, the intermittent noises behind the walls increased in amplitude and frequency. Around on the far side of the cylinder, next to one of the larger support machines, a door opened and two carpets, moving inchworm style, came into the room. They were immediately followed by two wardens and 4 platforms on treads. The platforms were carrying stacks of building materials. Each of the wardens led 2 platforms to a corner of the room, where they started constructing secure anchor stanchions for the cylinder. The 2 carpets confronted Nick in the center of the room. They stood up on end and leaned in the direction of the exit toward the ocean. "They're telling us it's time to go," Carol said as she and Troy came up beside Nick. "I understand that," Nick replied, "but I'm not yet ready to leave." He turned to Troy. "Does this game have an X key at all?" he asked. "I could use a time-out." Troy laughed. "I don't think so, Professor, and there's no way we can save the game and try again." Nick looked as if he were in deep thought. The carpets continued to beckon. "Come on, Nick," Carol grabbed him by the arm. "Let's go before they get angry." Suddenly, Nick advanced toward one of the carpets and extended the golden cradle. "Here," he said. "Take this and put it with the rest of them, up there in the cylinder where it belongs." The carpet recoiled and twisted its top from side to side. Then it pulled its 2 vertical sides together and pointed at Nick. "I don't need a bracelet to interpret that gesture," Troy remarked. "The carpet is plainly telling you to take the trident back to your boat." Nick nodded his head and was quiet for a moment. "Is this the only one we're on? We deserve the chance." There was no movement in the room for several seconds after Troy finished. Then the warden in front of him jerked sideways and began to move. Troy braced for an attack, but the warden moved in the direction of the exit next to the cylinder. The bracelet and cradle could still be seen inside its body. "All right, team," Troy shouted happily. Nick and Carol hugged. Troy took Commander Winters by the hand. As they were leaving, the 4 of them turned around one last time to look at the large chamber. In this final view, each one of them saw the room in terms of his own amazing experiences. The noises had begun again behind the walls, and the carpets, platforms, and wardens were filing out of the room through the door beside the covered cylinder. They had only been on board the boat for 3 or 4 minutes when the water underneath them suddenly became very turbulent. They were strangely quiet, all 4 of them. A frustrated Lieutenant Ramirez paced about the deck, trying to get someone to tell him what had happened under the water. Even Commander Winters virtually ignored the lieutenant and just shook his head or gave simple answers to all his questions. They were certain that the spaceship was about to launch. They didn't realize that it would glide gently away from their area first, so that it would not submerge them with a giant wave before breaking the water and heading into the sky. The water stayed agitated for several minutes. All of them scanned the ocean for a sign of the vehicle.
"Look!"
yelled Commander Winters excitedly, pointing at a giant silver bird lifting into the sky about 45 degrees away from the early morning sun. Its rise was initially slow, but as it rose, it accelerated rapidly. Nick and Carol and Troy clasped hands tightly as they watched the awesome spectacle. Winters came over and stood beside the trio. After 30 seconds, the craft had disappeared above the clouds. There was never any sound.
"Fantastic," said Commander Winters.
Grateful acknowledgment is given to quote from the following: Light My Fire, copyright 1967 by Doors Music Incorporated. Time After Time, copyright 1983 by Cyndi Lauper and Bob Hyman. Dub Notes and Rella Music Company. All rights on behalf of Dub Notes Music. Administered by Warner Brothers. Music Corporation, all rights reserved, used by permission. Memory, lyrics, copyright 1981 by Trevor Nunn. Administered by Screen Gems /EMI. End of Cradle by Arthur C. Clarke and Gentry Lee.